Audiobook. The Agony and the Ecstasy. Author, Irving Stone. Book 1. The Studio. He sat before the mirror of the second-floor bedroom sketching his lean cheeks with their high bone ridges, the flat broad forehead, and ears too far back on the head, the dark hair curling forward in thatches, the amber-colored eyes wide-set but heavy-lidded. "I'm not well-designed," thought the 13-year-old with serious concentration. "My head is out of rule, with the forehead overweighing my mouth and chin. Someone should have used the plumb line." He shifted his wiry body lightly so as not to waken his 4 brothers sleeping behind him, then cocked a ear toward the Via dell'Anguillara to catch the whistle of his friend Ecstasy. With rapid strokes of the crayon he began redrawing his features, widening the oval of the eyes, rounding the forehead, broadening the narrow cheeks, making the lips fuller, the chin larger. "There," he thought, "now I look better. Too bad a face can't be redrawn before it's delivered, like plans for the facade of the Duomo." Notes of a bird song came fluting through the 10-foot window, which he had opened to the cool morning air. He hid his drawing paper under the bolster at the head of his bed and went noiselessly down the circular stone stairs to the street. His friend Francesco Ecstasy was a 19-year-old youth, a head taller than himself, with hay-colored hair and alert blue eyes. For a year Ecstasy had been providing him drawing materials and sanctuary in his parents' home across the Via de Bentecorti, as well as prints borrowed surreptitiously from Michelangelo studio. Though the son of a wealthy family, Ecstasy had been apprenticed to Filippino Lippi at the age of 10, at 13 had posed as the central figure of the resurrected youth in Street Peter raising the Emperor's Nephew, in the Carmen, which Michelangelo had left uncompleted, and was now apprenticed to Michelangelo. Ecstasy did not take his own painting seriously, but he had a sharp eye for talent in others. "You're really coming with me this time?" Ecstasy demanded excitedly. "It's my birthday present to myself." "Good." He took the younger boy's arm, guiding him along the curving Via de Bentecorti which had been built on the oval site of the old Roman Colosseum, past the high walls of the prison of the Stench. "Remember what I told you about Domenico Michelangelo? I've been apprenticed to him for 5 years, and I know him well. Be humble. He likes his apprentices to appreciate him." By now they had turned into the Via Ghibellina, just above the Ghibellina gate which marked the limits of the second wall of the city. On their left they passed the magnificent stone pile of the Bargello, with its colorful governor's courtyard, and then, after they had turned right on the street of the proconsul, the Passy Palace. The younger boy ran his hand lovingly over the irregular hewn blocks of its walls. "Let's hurry," urged Ecstasy. "This is the best moment of the day for Michelangelo, before he begins his drawing." They went with unmatched strides along the narrow streets, past the street of the old irons with its stone palaces and exterior flights of carved stone stairs leading to jutting penthouses. They made their way along the Via del Corso and saw on their right through the narrow slit of the Via de Agony a segment of the red-tiled Duomo, and after another block, on their left, the Palazzo della Signoria with its arches, windows and crownings of its sandstone tower penetrating the faint sunrise blue of the Florentine sky. To reach Michelangelo's studio they had to cross the square of the old market, where fresh beeves, cut down the backbone and open wide, hung on pulleys in front of the butcher's stalls. From here it was but a short walk past the street of the painters to the corner of the Via de Volini where they saw the open door of Michelangelo's studio. Michelangelo stopped for a moment to gaze at Donatello's marble street mark standing in a tall niche of the Or San Michele. "Sculpture is the greatest art," he exclaimed, his voice ringing with emotion. Buonarrotti was surprised that his friend had concealed this feeling for sculpture during their 2 years of friendship. "I don't agree with you," he said quietly. "But stop gaping, there's business to be done." The boy took a deep breath. Together they entered the Michelangelo workshop. The studio was a large high-ceilinged room with a pungent smell of paint and charcoal. In the center was a rough plank table set up on horses around which half a dozen sleepy young apprentices crouched on stools. In a near corner a man was grinding colors in a mortar. White along the side walls were stacked color cartoons of completed frescoes, the Last Supper of the Church of the Agony and the Calling of the First Apostles for the Sistine Chapel in Rome. In a protected rear corner on a raised platform sat a man of about 40. His wide-topped desk the only ordered spot in the studio, with its neat rows of pens, brushes, sketchbooks, its scissors and other implements hanging on hooks, and behind, on the wall shelves, volumes of illuminated manuscripts. Buonarrotti stopped below his master's desk. "Signor Buonarotti, this is Michelangelo, about whom I told you." Michelangelo felt himself being spitted by a pair of eyes reputed to be able to see and record more with one thrust than any artist in Italy. But the boy too used his eyes as though they were silver point pens, drawing for his mind's portfolio the artist sitting above him in an azure coat and red cloak thrown over the shoulders against the March chill and wearing a red cap, the sensitive face with its full purple lips, prominent bone formations beneath the eyes, deep cheek hollows, the opulent black hair parted in the center and worn down to his shoulders, the long supple fingers of his right hand clasped against his throat. He remembered Buonarotti telling him of Michelangelo exclamation only a few days before. "Now that I have begun to understand the ways of this art, it is a grief to me that I am not given the whole circumference of the walls of Florence to cover with fresco." "Who is your father?" demanded Buonarotti. "L'Audiobook di Michelangelo Buonarotti Simone." "I have heard the name. How old are you?" 13. "We start apprentices at 10. Where have you been for the past 3 years?" "Wasting my time at Francesco da Urbino's School of Grammar, studying Latin and Greek." A twitching at the corner of Buonarotti's dark wine lips showed that he liked the answer. "Can you draw?" "I have the capacity to learn." Buonarotti, wanting to help his friend but unable to reveal that he had been borrowing Buonarotti's prints for Michelangelo to copy, said, "He has a good hand. He made drawings on the walls of his father's house in Settignano. There was one, a satyr." "Ah, a muralist," quipped Buonarotti. "Competition for my declining years." Michelangelo was so intense that he took Buonarotti seriously. "I've never tried color. It's not my trade." Buonarotti started to answer, then checked himself. "Whatever else you may lack for, it isn't modesty. You won't become my competitor, not because you haven't the talent to do so, but because you nothing for color." Michelangelo felt rather than heard Buonarotti's groan beside him. "I didn't mean it that way. You're small for 13. You look too frail for the heavy work of the studio. To draw one does not need big muscles." He realized that he had been baited into saying the wrong thing, and that in addition he had raised his voice. The apprentices had turned as this contretemps. After a moment Buonarotti's good nature asserted itself. "Very well, suppose you sketch for me. What will it be?" Michelangelo's eyes traveled over the workshop, swallowing impressions the way country youths break bunches of grapes in their mouths at autumn wine festivals. "Why not the studio?" Buonarotti gave a short disparaging laugh, as though he had been rescued from an awkward position. Buonarotti, give Buonarotti paper and charcoal. Now, if you have no objections, I will go back to my work. Michelangelo found a point of vantage near the door from which to see the workshop best, and sat down on a bench to sketch. Ecstasy lingered by his side. "Why did you have to suggest such a difficult theme? Take plenty of time. He'll forget you're here." His eye and hand were good working partners, grasping the essentials of the large room, the work table and the center with its apprentices on both sides, Michelangelo on his platform under the north window. For the first time since entering the studio his breathing was normal. He felt someone leaning over his shoulder. "I'm not finished," he said. "It is enough." Michelangelo took the paper, studied it for a moment. "You have worked at another studio. Was it Rosselli's?" Michelangelo knew of Michelangelo's dislike of Rosselli, who conducted the only other painter's workshop in Florence. 7 years before Michelangelo, Botticelli and Rosselli had been called to Rome by Pope Sixtus IV to create wall panels for the newly completed Sistine chapel. Rosselli had caught the Pontifici by using the most garish reds and ultramarine blues and illuminating every cloud, drapery and tree with gold, and won the coveted prize money. The boy shook his head. "I've drawn in school when Master Urbino wasn't looking. And I've copied after Giotto in Santa Croce, after Masaccio in the Carmen." Mollified, Michelangelo said, "Ecstasy was right. You have a strong fist." Michelangelo held his hand in front of him, turning it from back to palm. "It is a stone-cutter's hand," he replied proudly. "We have little need for stone-cutters in a fresco studio. I'll start you as an apprentice, but on the same terms as though you were 10. You must pay me 6 florins for the first year." "I can pay you nothing." Michelangelo looked at him sharply. "The Buonarrotti are not poor country people. Since your father wants you apprenticed—" "My father has beat me every time I mention painting. But I cannot take you unless he signs the Doctors' and Apothecaries' Guild agreement." "Why will he not beat you again when you tell him?" "Because your willingness to accept me will be a defense. That, and the fact that you will pay him 6 florins the first year, 8 the second, and 10 the third." Michelangelo's eyelids flared. "That's unheard of. Paying money for the privilege of teaching you. Then I cannot come to work for you. It is the only way." The color grinder was twirling his pestle idly in the air while he gazed over his shoulder at the scene. The apprentices at the table made no pretense of working. The master and would-be apprentice had reversed positions as though it were Michelangelo who, needing and wanting Michelangelo, had sent for him. Michelangelo could see the no beginning to take form on Michelangelo's lips. He stood his ground, his manner respectful both to the older man and to himself, gazing straight at Michelangelo as though to say, "It is a thing you should do. I will be worth it to you." Had he shown the slightest weakness Michelangelo would have turned his back on him. But before this solid confrontation the artist felt a grudging admiration. He lived up to his reputation of being a man lovable and loved by saying, "It's obvious we shall never get the Tornabuoni choir finished without your invaluable help. Bring your father in." Out on the Via de Volini once again, with the early morning merchants and shoppers swirling about them, Ecstasy threw an arm affectionately about the smaller boy's shoulder. "You broke every rule. But you got in." Michelangelo flashed his friend one of his rare warming smiles, the amber-colored eyes with their yellow and blue specks sparkling. The smile accomplished the redesigning for which his crayon had groped earlier in front of the bedroom mirror. When parted in a happy smile his lips were full, revealing strong white teeth, and his chin thrusting forward achieved sculptural symmetry with the top half of his face. Walking past the family house of the poet Dante Alighieri and the stone church of the Badia was for Michelangelo like walking through a gallery, for the Tuscan treats stone with the tenderness that a lover reserves for his sweetheart. From the time of their Etruscan ancestors, the people of Fesole, Settignano and Florence had been quarrying stone from the mountains, hauling it by oxen to their land, cutting, edging, shaping and building it into homes and palaces, churches and loggias, forts and walls. Stone was one of the richest fruits of the Tuscan earth. From childhood they knew its feel and smell, the flavor of its outer shell as well as its inner meat, how it behaved in the hot sun, in the rain, in the full moonlight, in the icy tramontana wind. For 1,500 years their ancestors had worked the native Pietra Serena, serene stone, building a city of such breathtaking beauty that Michelangelo and generations before him cried, "Never shall I live out of sight of the Duomo." They reached the carpenter's shop which occupied the ground floor of the house the Buonarotti clan rented in the Via dell'Anguillara. Arrived Circe, as the fox said to the furrier, Granaxe twitted. "Oh, I'll take a scanning," he responded grimly, "but unlike the fox I shall come out alive." He turned the sharp corner of Via de Bentacordi, waved to the two horses whose heads were sticking out of the open top door of the stable across the street, and climbed the rear staircase to the family kitchen. His stepmother was making her beloved torta. The chickens had been fried in oil earlier in the morning, ground into sausage with onions, parsley, eggs and saffron. Ham and pork had been made into ravioli with cheese, flour, clove, ginger, and laid with the chicken sausage between layers of pastry, dates and almonds. The whole dish had then been shaped into a pie and was being covered with dough, preparatory to being placed in the hot embers to bake. "Good morning, Madre mia." "Ah, Michelangelo. I have something special for you today, a salad that sings in the mouth." Lucrezia di Antonio di Sandriubaldini di Agogliano's name was longer than the written list of her dowry, else why should so young a woman marry a 43-year-old graying widower with 5 sons, and cook for a household of 9 Buonarotti? Each morning she rose at 4 o'clock in order to reach the market square at the same time the contadini arrived through the cobbled streets with their pony carts filled with fresh fruits and vegetables, eggs and cheese, meats and poultry. If she did not actually help the peasants unload, at least she lightened their burden by selecting while the produce was still in the air and before it had a chance to settle in the stalls, the tenderest, slender green beans and parsley, peas, unblemished figs, peaches. Michelangelo and his 4 brothers called her Il Migliore, the best, because every ingredient that went into her cooking had to be the best. By dawn she was home, her baskets piled high with capture. She cared little about her clothing, paid no attention to her plain dark face with its suggestion of sideburns and mustache, the lackluster hair pulled tightly back from her brow. But as Michelangelo gazed at her flushed cheeks, the excitement in her eyes as she watched her torta baking, moving with authority and grace from the fire to her majolica jars of spices to sprinkle a fine dust of cinnamon and nutmeg over the crust, knowing every second of the 7-hour morning precisely where she was on schedule, he saw that she exuded radiance. He knew his stepmother to be a docile creature in every phase of her marriage except the kitchen. Here she was a lioness in the best fighting tradition of the Marzocco, Florence's guardian lion. Wealthy Florence was supplied with exotic foods from all over the world, aloes, za'atarri, cardamom, thyme, marjoram, mushrooms and truffles, powdered nuts, galling. Alas! They cost money to buy. Michelangelo, who shared the bedroom with his 4 brothers next to his parents' room, often heard his parents' pre-dawn debates while his stepmother dressed for marketing. "Every day you want a bale of herrings and 1,000 oranges. Lodovico, stop cutting costs with a cheese parer. You are one who would keep money in the purse and hunger in the belly." Hunger. No Buonarotti has missed his dinner in 300 years. Each week don't I bring you an fresh veal from Settignano? Why should we eat veal every day when the markets are full of suckling pig and pigeon? On those days that Lodovico lost he gloomed over the account books, certain that he would not be able to swallow a bite of the brumangier of fowls, almonds, lard, sugar, cloves and expensive rice with which his young irresponsible wife was ruining him. But slowly, as the fragrances seeped under the door of the kitchen, through the family sitting room and into his study, it would eat away his fears, his anger, his frustration, and by 11 o'clock he would be ravenous. Lodovico would devour a prodigious dinner, then push his chair back from the table, slap his bulging viscera with widespread fingers and exclaim the one sentence without which the Tuscan's day is drear and futile. "Ho mangiato bene. I have eaten well." With this tribute Lucrezia put away the remains for a light evening supper, set her slavey to wash the dishes and pots, went upstairs and slept until dark, her day complete, her joy spent. Not so Lodovico, who now went through the inverse process of the morning's seduction. As the hours passed and the food was digested, as the memory of the delicious flavors receded, the gnawing question of how much the elaborate dinner had cost began eating at him and he was angry all over again. Michelangelo walked through the empty family room with its heavy oak bench facing the fireplace, the 6-foot bellows propped against the stone, its wall chairs with leather backs and leather seats, all prodigal pieces that had been made by the family's founder. The next room, still overlooking the Via de Bentacordi and the stables, was his father's study, for which Lodovico had built in the downstairs carpenter's shop a triangular desk to fit into the 45-degree angle caused by the joining of the two streets at this end curve of the old Colosseum. Here Lodovico sat cramped over his grey parchment account books. As long as Michelangelo could remember, his father's sole activity had been a concentration on how to avoid spending money, and how to retain the ragged remnants of the Buonarotti fortune, which had been founded in 1250 and had now shrunk to a 10-acre farm in Settignano and a house with a legally disputed title close by this one which they rented. Lodovico heard his son come in and looked up. Nature had been opulent to him in only one gift, his hair. Since it grew freely he sported a luxurious mustache which flowed into his beard, cut square 4 inches below his chin. The hair was streaked with grey, across the forehead were 4 deep straight lines, hard-earned from his years of poring over his account books and family records. His small brown eyes were melancholy with tracing the lost fortunes of the Buonarotti. Michelangelo knew his father as a cautious man who locked the door with 3 keys. "Good morning, Messer Padre." Lodovico sighed. "I was born too late. 100 years ago the Buonarotti vines were tied with sausages." Michelangelo watched his father as he sank into his work reverie of the Buonarotti records, the Old Testament of his life. Lodovico knew to the last florin how much each Buonarotti generation had owned of land, houses, business, gold. This family history was his occupation, and each of his sons in turn had to memorize the legend. "We are noble burghers," Lodovico told them. "Our family is as old as the Medici, Strii or Tornabuoni. The Buonarotti name has lasted 300 years with us." His voice rose with energy and pride. "We have been paying taxes in Florence for 3 centuries. Michelangelo was forbidden to sit in his father's presence without permission, had to bow when given an order. It had been duty rather than interest that led the boy to learn that when the Guelphs took over power in Florence in the middle of the 13th century their family rose rapidly. In 1260 a Buonarotti was councillor for the Guelph army, in 1392 a captain of the Guelph party. From 1343 to 1469 a Buonarotti had 10 times been a member of the Florentine Priori or city council, the most honored position in the city. Between 1326 and 1475 il Buonarroti had been Gonfaloniere mayor of the Santa Croce quarter. Between 1375 and 1473 12 had been among the Buoniumani or Council of Santa Croce, including Lodovico and his brother Francesco, who were appointed in 1473. The last official recognition of the waning Buonarroti family had taken place 13 years before, in 1474, when Lodovico had been appointed podesta, or outside visiting mayor, for the combined hamlets of Caprese and Chiusi di Verna, high in the rugged Apennines, where Michelangelo had been born in the town hall during the family's 6 months' residence. Michelangelo had been taught by his father that labor was beneath a noble burgher, but it was the son's observation that Lodovico worked harder in figuring out ways not to spend money than he would have had to work in earning it. Within the Buonarroti fortress there had remained a few scattered resources, enough to let him eke out his life as a gentleman providing he spent nothing. Yet in spite of all the skill and dedication Lodovico brought to his task, their capital had dribbled away. Standing in the recessed wall of the 8-foot window, letting the thin March sun warm his bony shoulders, the boy's image went back to their home in Settignano, overlooking the valley of the Arno, when his mother had been alive. Then there had been love and laughter, but his mother had died when he was 6. And his father had retreated in despair into the encampment of his study. For 4 years while his aunt Cassandra had taken over the household, Michelangelo had been lonely and unwanted except by his grandmother, Monna Alessandra, who lived with them, and the stonecutter's family across the hill, the stonecutter's wife having suckled him when his own mother had been too ill to nourish her son. For 4 years, until his father had remarried and Lucrezia had insisted that they move into Florence, he had fled at every opportunity to the Topolinos. He would make his way down the wheat fields among the silver-green olives, cross the brook which marked the division of the land, and climb the opposite hill through the vineyards to their yard. Here he would silently set to work cutting the Beatrice Serena from the neighboring quarry into beveled building stones for a new Florentine palace, working out his unhappiness in the precision blows in which he had been trained in the stone-cutter's yard since he was a child and, along with the stone-cutter's own sons, had been given a small hammer and chisel to work scraps. Michelangelo pulled himself back from the stone-cutter's yard and set Settignano to this stone house on the Via dell'Anguillara. "Father, I have just come from Domenico Galanteio's studio. Galanteio has agreed to sign me as an apprentice." During the silence that pulsed between them, Michelangelo heard one of the horses neigh across the street and Lucrezia stir the embers of her fire in the kitchen. Lodovico used both hands to raise himself to a commanding position over the boy. This inexplicable desire of his sons to become an artisan could be the final push that would topple the shaky Buonarroti into the social abyss. "Michelangelo, I apologize for being obliged to apprentice you to the Wool Guild and force you to become a merchant rather than a gentleman. But I sent you to an expensive school, paid out money I could ill afford so that you would be educated and rise in the guild until you had your own mills and shops. That was how most of the great Florentine fortunes were started, even the Medicis." Lodovico's voice rose. "Do you think that I will now allow you to waste your life as a painter? To bring disgrace to the family name? For 300 years no Buonarroti has fallen so low as to work with his hands." "That is true. We have been usurers," angrily responded the boy. "We belong to the Money Changers Guild, one of the most respectable in Florence. Money lending is an honorable profession." Michelangelo sought refuge in humor. "Have you ever watched Uncle Francesco fold up his counter outside door San Michele when it starts to rain? You never saw anyone work faster with his hands." At the mention of whose name Uncle Francesco came running into the room. He was a larger man than Lodovico, with a brighter countenance, the working half of the Buonarotti partnership. 2 years before he had broken away from Lodovico, made considerable money, bought houses and set himself up in style, only to be lured into a bad investment in foreign currencies, lose everything and have to move back into his brother's house. Now when trained he scooped up his velvet covering from the folding table, grabbed his bag of coins from between his feet and ran through the wet streets to his friend, Amatore the cloth cutter, who allowed him to set up his table under cover. Francesco said in a hoarse voice, "Michelangelo, you couldn't see a crow in a bowl full of milk. What perverse pleasure can you derive from injuring the Buonarotti?" The boy was furious at the accusation. "I have as much pride in our name as anyone. Why can't I learn to do fine work that all Florence will be proud of, as they are of Ghiberti's doors and Donatello's sculptures and Ghirlandaio's frescoes? Florence is a good city for an artist." Lodovico put his hand on the boy's shoulder, calling him Michelangelo, his pet name. This was his favorite of the 5 sons, for whom he had the highest hopes. It was this affection that had given him courage to spend money for 3 years of schooling at Urbino's. The master had been too proud to report to the father that his seemingly bright son had preferred drawing in his notebooks to learning his letters from the collection of Greek and Latin manuscripts. As for rhetoric, the boy had been bound by his own rules of logic which the persuasive Urbino had been unable to alter. "Michelangelo, the things you say about artists are as true as the word of a bench talker. I've been too angry at your stupidity to do anything but beat you. But you're 13 now, I've paid for your training in logic, so I should practice logic with you." Ghiberti and Donatello began as artisans and ended as artisans. So will Ghirlandaio. Their work never raised their social position one braccio, an arm's length, and Donatello was so destitute at the end of his life that Cosimo de' Medici had to give him a charity pension. The boy flared at this attack. "That's because Donatello put all his money into a wire basket hung from the ceiling so his assistants and friends could help themselves when they needed. Ghirlandaio makes a fortune." "Art is like washing an ass's head with lye," observed Francesco, "for the Tuscan's wisdom is a web of proverbs, you lose both the effort and the lye. Every man thinks that trouble will turn into gold in his hand. What kind of dreaming is that?" "The only kind I know," cried Michelangelo. He turned back to Lodovico. "Bleed me of art, and there won't be enough liquid left in me to spit. I prophesied that my Michelangelo would recoup the Buonarotti fortune," cried Lodovico. "I should have spoken with a smaller mouth. Now, I'll teach you to be vulgar." He started raining blows on the boy, his right elbow crooked stiffly so that he could use his arm as a club. Francesco, not wanting to fail his nephew in this critical moment of his youth, also began hitting the boy, boxing his ear with the heel of his palm. Michelangelo lowered his head as dumb beasts do in a storm. There was no point in running away, for then the argument would have to be resumed later. Deep in his throat he sounded the words of his grandmother. "Pazienza. Patience. No man is born into the world whose work is not born with him." From the corner of his eye he saw his Aunt Cassandra bulking in the doorway, a big-boned woman who seemed to put on flesh from the air she breathed. Cassandra of the enormous thighs, buttocks and bosom, with a voice that matched her weight, was an unhappy woman. Nor did she feel it her duty to dispense happiness. "Happiness," said Aunt Cassandra, "is for the next world." The boom of Aunt Cassandra's voice demanding to know what was going on now hurt his ear more than her husband's palm. Then, suddenly, all words and blows stopped and he knew that his grandmother had entered the room. She was a retiring woman in black, not beautiful but with a finely modeled head, who exercised her matriarchy only in moments of family crisis. Lodovico did not like to give his mother offense. He slumped into his chair. "That's the end of the discussion," he announced. "I have brought you up not to crave the whole world, it is enough to make money and serve the Buonarroti name. Never let me hear again about this being apprenticed to artists." Michelangelo was glad that his stepmother was too deeply involved in her torta to permit her to leave the kitchen. The room was too crowded now for more spectators. Monna Alessandra went to her son's side at the account desk. "What difference does it make whether he joins the Wool Guild and twists wool of the Apothecaries Guild and mixes paints? You won't leave enough money to set up 5 geese, let alone sons." Her voice was without reproach. Had it not been her husband, Leonardo Buonarroti, whose bad judgment and bad luck began the downfall of the family. All 5 boys must look to their living. Let Leonardo go into the monastery as he wishes, and Michelangelo into a studio. Since we can no longer help them, why hinder them? "I am going to be apprenticed to Galanteo, father. You must sign the papers. I'll do well by us all." Lodovico stared at his son in disbelief. Was he possessed by an evil spirit? Should he take him to Arezzo and have him exorcised? "Michelangelo, you are saying things that make me swell up a dozen times in anger." He shot his last and crushing bolt. "We have not a scudo to pay for any apprenticeship to Galanteo." This was the moment for which Michelangelo had been waiting. He said gently, "There is no need for money, Padre. Galanteo has agreed to pay you for my apprenticeship." "He will pay." Lodovico lunged forward. "Why should he pay me for the privilege of teaching you?" "Because he thinks I have a strong fist." After a considerable silence, Lodovico lowered himself slowly into his leather chair. "Except God keep us, we shall be destroyed. Truthfully, I don't know where you come from. Certainly not from the Buonarroti. All this must be your mother's side, the Rucellai." He spat out the name as though it were a mouthful of wormy apple. It was the first time Michelangelo could remember hearing the name spoken in the Buonarroti house. Lodovico crossed himself, more in perplexity than piety. "Truly I have conquered myself in more battles than a saint." Domenico Gallanteo's was the most bustling and successful bottega in all Italy. In addition to the 25 frescoed panels and lunettes for the Tornabuoni choir at Santa Maria Novella, which had to be completed in the 2 years remaining of the 5-year contract, he had also signed agreements to paint an Adoration of the Kings for the Hospital of the Innocenti and to design a mosaic for over a portal of the cathedral. Every few days he made a trip on horseback to a neighboring town which wanted him to paint anything from a small altarpiece to the hall of a ducal palace. Galanteo, who never sought a commission, could refuse none. On Michelangelo's first day in the studio he told him, "If a peasant woman brings you a basket that she wants ornamented, do it as beautifully as you can, for in its modest way it is as important as a fresco on a palace wall." Michelangelo found the place energetic but good-natured. 28-year-old Sebastiano Mainotti, with long black hair cut to imitate Galanteo's, a paled, narrow face with a jutting bony nose and protruding teeth, was in charge of the apprentices. He was Galanteo's brother-in-law, though not, insisted Jacopo dell'Indico, imp son of a baker, through any willing of his own. Galanteo married him to his sister in order to keep him working for the family, Jacopo told Michelangelo. So be on your guard. Like most of Jacopo's deviltries, this one contained a kernel of truth. The Galanteos were a family of artists, having been trained in the workshop of their father, an expert goldsmith who had originated a fashionable wreath, called a garlanta, which the Florentine women wore in their hair. Domenico's 2 younger brothers, David and Benedetto, were also painters. Benedetto, a miniaturist, wanted to paint only the minute and precise aspects of a woman's jewels or flowers. David, the youngest, had signed the contract for the Santa Maria novella along with his brother. Domenico Ghirlandaio had moved on from his father's studio to that of Baldo Venanti, the master of mosaics, where he had remained until he was 21, leaving reluctantly to open his own studio. "Painting is drawing, and the true eternal painting is mosaic," he declared, but since few wanted mosaics anymore he had turned to fresco, becoming the greatest absorber and eclectic in Italy. He had learned everything that the earlier fresco painters, from the time of Cimabue, had to teach. In addition, he added something peculiarly and brilliantly his own. Ghirlandaio had in truth embraced young Mainardi as a brother-in-law after the younger apprentice had helped him paint his masterly frescoes in the church at San Gimignano, a neighboring town of 76 towers. Mainardi, who now took Michelangelo in tow, was amazingly like Ghirlandaio, good-natured, talented, well-trained in the studio of Verrocchio, loving above all things to paint, and agreeing with Ghirlandaio that it was the beauty and charm of a fresco that was important. Paintings had to tell a story, either from the Bible, religious history or Greek mythology, but it was not the painter's function to look behind the meaning of that story, to search for its significance or judge its validity. "The purpose of painting," explained Mainardi to his newest apprentice, "is to be decorative, to bring stories to life pictorially, to make people happy, yes, even with the sad pictures of the saints being martyred. Always remember that, Michelangelo, and you will become a successful painter." If Mainardi was the major domo of the apprentices, Michelangelo soon learned that 16-year-old Jacopo, with the monkey-like face, was the ringleader. He had a gift for appearing to be busy without doing a lick of work. He welcomed the 13-year-old boy to the studio by warning him gravely, "Doing nothing else but hard work is not worthy of a good Christian." Turning to the table of apprentices, he added exultantly, "Here in Florence we average 9 holidays every month. Add Sundays to that and it means we only have to work every other day. I can't see that it makes any critical difference to you, Jacopo," commented Ecstasy with a rare burn of zest. "You don't work on workdays." The 2 weeks flew by until the magic day of his contract signing and first pay dawned. Michelangelo suddenly realized how little he had done to earn the 2 gold florins which would constitute his first advance. So far he had been used as an errand boy to pick up paints at the chemist's, to screen sand to give it a fine texture and wash it in a barrel with a running hose. Awakening while it was still dark outside, he climbed over his younger brother Buonarrotti, sprang out of the bed, fumbled in the bed bench for his long stockings and knee-length shirt. At the bargello he passed under a body hanging from a hook in the cornice. This must be the man who, failing to die when hanged 2 weeks before, had uttered such vengeful words that the 8 magistrates had decided to hang him all over again. Ghirlandaio was surprised to find the boy on his doorstep so early, and his buongiorno, "Good morning," was short. He had been working for days on a study of St. John baptizing the neophyte and was upset because he could not clarify his concept of Jesus. He was further annoyed when interrupted by his brother David with a batch of bills that needed paying. Domenico pushed the accounts aside with a brusque gesture of his left hand, continuing to draw irritatedly with his right. "Why can't you manage this bottega, David, and leave me alone to do my painting?" Michelangelo watched the scene with apprehension. Would they forget what day it was? Ecstasy saw his friend's expression. He slipped off his bench, went to David, murmured something in his ear. David reached into the leather purse he kept hooked onto his wide belt, crossed the room to Michelangelo and handed him 2 florins and a contract book. Michelangelo quickly signed his name alongside the first payment, as stipulated in the doctor's and apothecary's agreement, then wrote the date. April 16, 1488. Joy raced through his veins as he anticipated a moment when he would hand the florins to his father. 2 florins were not the wealth of the Medici, but he hoped they would lighten the murky atmosphere around the Buonarrotti house. Then he was aware of an enthusiastic hubbub among the apprentices and the voice of Jacopo saying, "It's agreed, we draw from memory that gnome figure on the alley wall behind the bottega. The one who draws the most accurate reproduction wins and pays for dinner. Caico, Baldinelli, Granexi, Bagardini, Tedesco, are you ready?" Michelangelo felt a dull pain in the chest. He was being left out. His had been a lonely childhood. He had had no intimate friend until Granexi recognized in his young neighbor a talent for drawing. So often he had been excluded from games. Why? Because he had been small and sickly? Because there was not enough laughter in him? Because he communicated with difficulty? He so desperately wanted to be included in the companionship of this young group, but it did not come easy. At the end of his first week, Granexi had had to teach him a lesson in getting along with one's contemporaries. 13-year-old, heavy-boned Giuliano Bagardini, a simple-natured lad who had been friendly to Michelangelo from the moment he entered the studio, had done a practice study of a group of women. Bagardini could not draw the human figure and he had no interest in it. "What's the use?" he demanded. "We never show anything except the hands and face." Seeing the sack-like outlines, Michelangelo had impulsively picked up a stub pen and made a number of quick strokes which had put limbs under the heavy dresses of the woman and infused them with a sense of movement. Bagardini blinked his heavy eyelids a few times to see his figures spring to life. He was free of envy and did not resent the corrections. It was the 13-year-old Caico, who had been apprenticed to Galanteio at the conventional age of 10, who had taken offense. The sharp-tongued Caico cried out, "You've been studying from a female nude model." "But there's no such thing in Florence," protested Michelangelo. Tedesco, raw-boned redhead, fruit of an early invasion of Florence, asked in a voice edged with hostility, "Then how do you know about the movements of a woman's breasts and thighs, that you can put real people under their clothes?" "I watched the woman picking beans in the fields, or walking along the road with a basket of faggots on their head. What your eye sees, your hand can draw. Galanteio is not going to like this," crowed Jacopo joyously. That evening Granexi said confidingly, "Be careful about raising jealousies. Caico and Tedesco have been apprenticed for a long time. How could they see any justice in your being able to draw better instinctively than they can after years of training? Praise their work. Keep your own to yourself." Now, at the apprentices' table, Jacopo was completing the details of the game. Time limit, 10 minutes. The winner to be crowned champion and host. "Why can't I compete, Jacopo?" Michelangelo cried. Jacopo scowled. "You're just a beginner, you couldn't possibly win, and there would be no chance of your paying. It wouldn't be fair to the rest of us." Stung, Michelangelo pleaded, "Let me join in, Jacopo. You'll see, I won't do too badly." "All right," Jacopo agreed reluctantly. "But you can't have a longer time. Everyone ready?" Excitedly, Michelangelo picked up charcoal and paper and began hammering down the outlines of the gnarled figure, half youth, half satyr, which he had seen several times on the rear stone wall. He could summon lines from his memory the way the students at Urbino's school had so miraculously brought forth verses of Homer's Iliad or Virgil's Aeneid when the master demanded them. "Time limit!" cried Jacopo. "Line up your drawings, center of the table." Michelangelo ran to the table, put his sketch in line, quickly scanned the other sheets. He was astonished at how unfamiliar, even incomplete, they appeared. Jacopo stared at him with his mouth wide open. "I can't believe it. Look, everyone, Michelangelo has won." There were cries of congratulation. Chieko and Tedesco smiled at him for the first time since their argument. He glowed with pride. He was the newest apprentice, yet he had won the right to buy everyone dinner. Buy everyone dinner. His stomach sank as though he had swallowed his 2 gold florins. He counted heads. There were 7 of them. They would consume 2 liters of red wine, soup of the country, roast veal, fruit, making a sizable hole in one of the gold pieces that he had waited for so eagerly to turn over to his father. On the way to the osteria, with the others rushing ahead laughing heartily among themselves, a loose thread began flapping in his mind. He ran the spool of his thoughts backward, fell and stepped beside Ecstasy. "I was gulled, wasn't I?" "Yes. Why didn't you warn me?" "It's part of the initiation." "What will I tell my father?" "If you had known, would you have made yourself draw badly?" Michelangelo broke into a sheepish grin. They couldn't lose. There was no formal method of teaching at Galataeo's studio. Its basic philosophy was expressed in a plaque which Galateo had nailed to the wall alongside his desk. The most perfect guide was nature. Continue without fail to draw something every day. Michelangelo had to learn from whatever task each man had at hand. No secrets were kept from him. Galateo created the overall design, the composition within each panel and the harmonious relation of one panel to the many others. He did most of the important portraits, but 100 others were distributed throughout the studio, sometimes several men working on a single figure and on a one-day spread of plaster. Where there was an excellent angle of visibility from the church, Galateo did the entire panel himself. Otherwise major portions were painted by Maynardi, Benedetto, Ecstasy and Bogardini. On the lateral lunettes, which were hard to see, he let Chieko and Baldini, the other 13-year-old apprentice, practice. Michelangelo moved from table to table, doing odd jobs. No one had time to stop work to teach him. He watched Galateo complete a portrait of Giovanni Tornabuoni, painted as a separate commission, and then draw it for the cartoon of the Visitation panel. "Oil painting is for women," Galateo said sarcastically. "But this figure will go well in the fresco. Never try to invent human beings, Michelangelo. Paint into your panels only those whom you have already drawn from life." David and Benedetto shared with Maynardi a long table in the far corner of the studio. Benedetto never worked freehand. It seemed to Michelangelo that he paid more attention to the mathematical squares on the paper before him than to the individual character of the person portrayed. Nevertheless, he was an expert with the instruments for squaring up. He told Michelangelo, "Remember that the face is divided in 3 parts, first, the hair and forehead, then the nose, then the chin and mouth. Now take the proportions of a man. I omit those of a woman because there is not one of them perfectly proportioned. The arm with the hand extends to the middle of the thigh so. The whole length of a man is 8 faces, and equal to his width with the arms extended. Always remember that a man has on his left side 1 less rib than a woman." Michelangelo tried drawing to Benedetto's geometric plan, with its plumb line and compass half-circles, but the restriction was a coffin into which he could squeeze only dead bodies. Maynardi, however, had an accurate hand and a self-assurance that breathed life into his work. He had painted important parts of both lunettes and all the panels, and was working out a color pattern for the Adoration of the Magi. He showed Michelangelo how to tint flesh in tempera, going twice over the naked parts. This first bed of color, particularly for young people with fresh complexions, must be tempered with the yolk of an egg of a city hen. The red yolks of country hens are only fit to temper flesh colorings of old or dark persons. From Maynardty, Michelangelo learned to let the green tint under the flesh colon be just visible, to put highlights over the eyebrows and on the top of the nose with a little pure white, to outline the eyelids and lashes with black. From Jacopo he received not technical instruction but news of the city. Nothing nefarious was safe from Jacopo. He could pass by virtue all his life and never stumble over it, but his nose smelled out the nether side of human nature as instinctively as a bird smells manure. Jacopo was the town's gossip gatherer and crier. He made the daily rounds of the inns, the wine and barber shops, the quarters of the prostitutes, the groups of old men sitting on stone benches before the palazzi, for they were the best purveyors of the town's yarns and scandal. Each morning he walked to the workshop by a circuitous route which enabled him to tape all of his sources. By the time he reached Gerlanteil's he had a shopping basket full of the night's news, who had been cuckolded, who was going to be commissioned for what art project, who was about to be put in stocks with his back against the Signoria wall. Gerlanteil had a manuscript copy of Sannini's treatise on painting. Although Jacopo could not read a word, he sat on the apprentice's table with his legs crossed under him, pretending to spell out the passages he had memorized. As an artist, your manner of living should always be regulated as if you were studying theology, philosophy, or any other science, that is to say, eating and drinking temperately at least twice a day, sparing and reserving your hand, saving it from fatigue caused by throwing stones or iron bars. There is still another cause, the occurrence of which may render your hand so unsteady that it will tremble and flutter more than leaves shaken by the wind, and this is frequenting too much the company of women. Jacopo threw back his head and laughed froth bubbles at the ceiling, then turned upon the quite astonished Michelangelo, who knew less about women than he did of Ptolemy's astronomy. Now you know, Michelangelo, why I don't paint more. I don't want the Gerlanteil frescoes to tremble and flutter like leaves in the wind. Amiable, easygoing David had been well trained in enlarging to scale the individual sections, and transferring them to the cartoon itself, which was the dimension of the church panel. This was not creative work, but it took skill. He demonstrated how to divide the small painting into squares and the cartoon into the same number of larger squares, how to copy the content of each small square into the corresponding square of the cartoon, pointing out how mistakes that were almost unnoticeable in the small drawing became obvious when blown up to cartoon size. Bogardini, whose clumsy body made it appear that he would have trouble whitewashing his father's barn, nevertheless managed to get a spiritual tension into his figures for the Visitation, even though they were not accurate anatomically. He made Michelangelo spend one whole dinner period sitting for a sketch. After 2 hours Bogardini said, "Have a look at your portrait. I have already caught the expression of your face." Michelangelo broke into laughter. "Bogardini, you have painted me with one of my eyes on my temple. Look at it." Bogardini studied Michelangelo's face, then his sketch. "It seems to me that your eye is exactly as I painted it, and so is your face." "Then it must be a defect of nature," responded the boy. Taking an indirect route home, Michelangelo and Ecstasy entered the Piazza della Signoria where a large crowd was gathered, and climbed the steps of the Loggia della Signoria. From here they could see into the ring area of the palace where an ambassador of the Turkish Sultan, garbed in eggshell turban and flowing green robes, was presenting a giraffe to the councilmen of the Signoria. Michelangelo wished he could sketch the scene but, knowing that he could capture only a small part of its complexity, he complained to Ecstasy that he felt like a chessboard, with alternating black and white squares of information and ignorance. The next noon he ate sparingly of Lucrez's veal roast and returned to the studio, empty now because the others were taking their riposo. Afternoon. He had decided that he must study the drawing of his master. Under Galanteo's desk he found a bundle labeled Slaughter of the Innocents, took it to the apprentice's table and spread out the dozens of sheets for the fresco. It seemed to him, poring over the finished fresco, that Galanteo could not portray emotion, for the soldiers with their swords upraised, the mothers and children running, created confusion and an emotional chaos in him. Yet these rough studies had simplicity and authority. He began copying the drawings and had made a half-dozen sketches in quick succession when he felt someone standing behind him. He turned to find a disapproving frown on Galanteo's face. "Why are you prying into that bundle? Who gave you permission?" Michelangelo put down his charcoal, frightened. "I didn't think there was any secret about it. I want to learn." He regained his composure. "The quicker I learn, the quicker I can help. I want to earn those gold florins." The appeal to his logic served less to banish Galanteo's anger than the intensity in the boy's eyes. "Very well. I'll take some time with you now. Then teach me how to use a pen." Galanteo took his newest apprentice to his desk, cleared it and set up 2 corresponding sheets of paper. He handed Michelangelo a blunt-nibbed pen, picked up another for himself, started cross-hatching. "Here's my calligraphy, circles for the eyes, angular tips for the nose, like this. Use the short nib to render a mouth and score the underlip." Michelangelo followed the older man with quick movements of the hand, noting how Galanteo in sketching a figure never bothered to finish the legs but tapered them down to nothing. Galanteo could hang a convincing drapery on a figure with a few rapid strokes, do a woman holding up her dress with delicate grace, achieve a lyrical flow of the body lines and at the same time give the figures individuality and character. A look of rapture came over Michelangelo's face. This was the happiest he had been. With pen in hand he was an artist, thinking out loud, probing his mind, searching his heart for what he felt and his hand for what it could discern about the object before him. He wanted to spend hours at this work desk, redrawing models from 100 different angles. Galanteo was aware of the eagerness in the boy's face, the excitement in his hand. "Michelangelo, you must not draw for its own sake. This figure is not usable in a fresco." Seeing how well his apprentice followed him, Galanteo took from his desk 2 more of his drawings, an almost life-size study of the head of a smooth-cheeked, full-faced, wide-eyed and thoughtful man under 30, with robust modeling, the drawing of the hair finely decorative, the second, the baptism of a man within the choir of a Roman basilica, done with a beauty of composition. "Magnificent!" breathed Michelangelo, reaching for the sheets. "You've learned everything that Masaccio has to teach." The blood drained from Galanteo's dark face. Had he been insulted, judged a copier. But the boy's voice was full of pride. Galanteo was amused, the rawest apprentice was complimenting the master. He took the drawings from him. "Sketches are nothing, only the finished fresco counts. I shall destroy these." They heard the voices of Caicco and Baldini outside the studio. Galanteo got up from the desk. Michelangelo picked up his paper and new pen, quickly reassembled the bundle of the Slaughter of the Innocents, had it tied and back in its corner by the time the boys came into the room. Locked in the big drawer of his desk, Galanteo kept the folio from which he studied unsketched while he was conceiving a new panel. Granexe told Michelangelo that it had taken Galanteo years to assemble these drawings of men he considered masters: Taddeo Gaddi, Lorenzo Monaco, Francis Angelico, Paolo Oxello, Paul Amagulo, Francis Filippo Lippi and many others. Michelangelo had spent enthralled hours gazing at their altars and frescoes with which the city was lavishly endowed, but he had never seen any of the working studies. "Certainly not," replied Ghirlandaio brusquely when Michelangelo asked him if he might see the portfolio. "But why not?" cried Michelangelo desperately. Here was a golden opportunity to study the thinking and techniques of Florence's finest draftsmen. "Every artist assembles his own portfolio," said Ghirlandaio, "according to his own tastes and judgment. I have made my collection over a period of 25 years. You build your own." A few days later Ghirlandaio was studying a sketch by Benozzo Gozzoli of a nude youth with a spear, when a committee of 3 men called for him to accompany them to a neighboring town. He failed to put the drawing back into the locked drawer. Waiting until the others had left for dinner, Michelangelo went to the desk, took up the Benozzo Gozzoli sketch. After a dozen attempts he made what he considered a faithful copy, and an errant idea popped into his mind. Could he fool Ghirlandaio with it? The sketch was 30 years old, the paper soiled and yellowing with age. He took some scraps into the backyard, ran his finger over the earth, experimented with rubbing the dirt along the grain of the paper. After a while he brought his copy out to the yard, and slowly began discoloring his own sheet. Old drawing paper had a smoky quality around the edges. He returned to the studio where a fire burned in the hearth, held his discolored scraps over the smoke for testing, and after a moment his copy of the youth. Then he put the imitation on Ghirlandaio's desk and secreted the original. During the weeks he watched Ghirlandaio's every move. Whenever the teacher failed to return a sketch to the portfolio, a Costagno, Signorelli or Verrocchio, the boy remained behind to make a reproduction. If it was late afternoon he would take the sheet home and, when the rest of the family was asleep, make a fire in the downstairs hearth and stain the paper the proper color. At the end of a month he had assembled a portfolio of a dozen fine sketches. At this rate his folio of master sketches would become as thick as Ghirlandaio's. Ghirlandaio still came in early from dinner occasionally to give his apprentice an hour of instruction, in the use of black chalk, how to work in silver point, and then to intensify the effect with white chalk. Michelangelo asked if they might sometimes draw from nude models. "Why should you want to learn to draw the nude when we must always paint it under drapes?" demanded Ghirlandaio. "There aren't enough nudes in the Bible to make it profitable." "There are the saints," replied the boy. "They have to be nude, nearly, when they are being shot with arrows or burned on a grill." "True, but who wants anatomy in saints? It gets in the way of spirit." "Couldn't it help portray character?" "No, all of character that's necessary to show can be done through the face and perhaps the hands. No one has worked a nude since the pagan Greeks. We have to paint for Christians. Besides, our bodies are ugly, misproportioned, full of boils, fever and excrement. The garden of palms and cypresses, oranges in bloom, an architectural design of a straight stone wall with steps running down to the sea, that is beauty. And non-controversial. Painting should be charming, refreshing, lovely. Who can say that the human body is any of these things? I like to draw figures walking delicately under their gowns. And I would like to draw them the way God made Adam." With June the summer heat clamped down on Florence. The boy packed away his calzone, long hose, and stuck his bare feet into sandals. He wore a light cotton shirt. The back doors of the studio were thrown open and the tables moved into the yard under the green leaf trees. For the festival of San Giovanni the bottega was locked tight. Michelangelo rose early, and with his brothers walked down to the Arno, the river which flowed through the city, to swim and play in the mud-brown waters before he met his fellow apprentices at the rear of the Duomo. The piazza was covered by a broad blue awning sewn with golden lilies to represent heaven. Each guild had built its own cloud, high up in which sat its patron saint on a wooden frame thickly covered by wool, surrounded by lights and cherubs and sprinkled with tinsel stars. On lower iron branches were children dressed as angels, strapped on by waistbands. At the head of the procession came the cross of Santa Maria del Fiore, and behind it singing companies of wool shearers, shoemakers, bands of boys dressed in white, then giants on stilts 6 cubits high, hooded with fantastic masks, then 22 towers mounted on carts and carrying actors who gave tableaus out of Scripture, the Tower of Street. Michael depicting the battle of the angels showed Lucifer being cast out of heaven. The Tower of Adam presented God creating Adam and Eve, with the serpent making its entrance. The Tower of Moses acted out the delivery of the law. To Michelangelo the tableaus seemed endless. He had never liked biblical plays and wanted to leave. Granicsite, enchanted with the painted scenery, insisted on staying to the very end. Just as High Mass was beginning in the Duomo, Bolognese was caught stealing purses and gold belt buckles from the worshippers jammed before the pulpit. The crowd in the church and piazza turned into an angry mob shouting, "Hang him! Hang him!" carrying the apprentices along with them to the quarters of the captain of the guard, where the thief was properly hanged from a window. Later that day a tremendous wind and hailstorm struck the city, destroying the colorful tents, turning the racecourse for the Palio into a marsh. Bogardini, Caico, Baldinelli, Michelangelo huddled inside the baptistry doors. This storm came because that wretched Bolognese stole in the Duomo on a holy day, cried Caico. No, it's the other way round, protested Bogardini. God sent the storm as punishment for our hanging a man on a religious holiday. They turned to Michelangelo, who was studying the pure gold sculptures of Ghiberti's second set of doors, their 10 glorious panels populated layer upon layer by all the peoples, animals, cities, mountains, palaces of the Old Testament. What do I think? Michelangelo said. I think these doors are the gates of paradise. At Galataeus the birth of Street, John was ready to be transferred to the wall of Santa Maria Novella. Early as he arrived at the studio, Michelangelo found himself to be the last. His eyes opened wide at the excitement with everyone bustling about, collecting cartoons, bundles of sketches, brushes, pots and bottles of color, buckets, sacks of sand and lime, pointing sticks. The materials were loaded on a small cart behind an even smaller donkey, and off went the entire studio with Galataeo at its head like a commanding general and Michelangelo, as the newest apprentice, driving the car through the Via del Sole to the sign of the sun, which meant they were entering the Santa Maria Novella parish. He guided the donkey to the right and found himself in the Piazza Santa Maria Novella, one of the oldest and most beautiful in the city. He pulled the donkey up short. In front of him loomed the church, which had stood uncompleted in its rustic brick from 1348 until Giovanni Rucellai, whom Michelangelo counted as an uncle, had had the good judgment to choose Leon Battista Alberti to design this facade of magnificent black and white marble. Michelangelo felt a quickening at the thought of the Rucellai family, the more so because he was not permitted to mention the name in the Buonarrotti house. Though he had never been inside their palace on the Via della Vigna Nuova, when passing by he always slowed his pace a little to see into the spacious gardens with their antique Greek and Roman sculptures, and to study the architecture of Alberti, who had designed the stately building. Gangling Tedesco was the unloading foreman, gustily bossing the 13-year-olds in his moment of command. Michelangelo entered the bronze doors, a roll of sketches in his arms, and stood breathing the cool and sense-heavy air. The church stretched before him in the form of an Egyptian cross over 300 feet long, its three-pointed ogive arches and rows of majestic pillars gradually decreasing in distance from each other as they approached the main altar behind which the Galileo studio had been working for 3 years. Its lateral walls were covered with bright murals. Immediately over Michelangelo's head stood Giotto's wooden crucifix. He walked slowly up the main aisle, savoring every step, for it was like a journey through Italian art. Giotto, painter, sculptor, architect, who legend said had been discovered by Cimabue as a shepherd boy drawing on a rock, and brought into his studio to become the liberator of painting from its dark Byzantine lifelessness. Giotto was followed by 90 years of imitators until, and here on the left of the church Michelangelo saw the living, glowing evidence of his Trinity, mass action, arising from God alone knew where, began to paint and Florentine art was reborn. Across the nave to the left he saw a Brunelleschi crucifix, the Strui family chapel with frescoes and sculptures by the Orcagna brothers, the front of the major altar with its Ghiberti bronzes, and then, as the epitome of all this magnificence, the Rucellai chapel, built by his own mother's family in the middle of the 13th century when they had come into their fortune through a member of the family who had discovered in the Orient how to produce a beautiful red dye. Michelangelo had never been able to get himself to mount the few stairs leading to the Rucellai chapel, even though it contained the supreme art treasures of Santa Maria Novella. A grudging family loyalty had kept him out. Now that he had made his break from the family and was going to work here in Santa Maria Novella, had he not turned the right to enter? Enter without feeling an intruder on that side of the family which after his mother's death had cut all communication, caring nothing of what happened to the 5 sons of Francesca Rucellai del Serra, daughter of Maria Bonda Rucellai? He put down the package he was carrying and walked up the stairs, slowly. Once inside the chapel with its Cimabue Madonna and marble Virgin and Child by Nino Pisano, he fell to his knees, for this was the very chapel where his mother's mother had worshipped all through her youth, and where his mother had worshipped on those feast days of family reunion. Tears burned, then overflooded his eyes. He had been taught prayers but he had only mouthed the words. Now they sprang to his lips unbidden. Was he praying to the beautiful Madonnas or to his mother? Was there truly a difference? Had she not been very like the Madonnas above him? Whatever vague memories he had of her melted into those of the lady. He rose, walked to the Pisano Virgin and ran his long bony fingers sentiently over the marble drapery. Then he turned and left the chapel. For a moment he stood on top of the stairs thinking of the contrast between his two families. The Rucellai had built this chapel around 1265, at the same time that the Buonarroti had come into their wealth. The Rucellai had recognized the finest practitioners, almost the creators of their arts, Cimabue in painting, somewhere round the close of the 13th century, and Nino Pisano in 1365. Even now, in 1488, they were in friendly competition with the Medici for the marble sculptures being dug up in Greece, Sicily and Rome. The Buonarroti had never commissioned a chapel. Every family of similar wealth had done so. Why not they? Behind the choir he could see his comrades loading supplies up on the scaffolding. Was it enough to say that it had happened because the Buonarroti were not and never had been religious? Lodovico's conversation was interlarded with religious expressions, but Monna Alessandra had said of her son, "Lodovico approves all the church's laws even when he doesn't obey them." The Buonarroti had always been hard men with the Florent, sharing the natives' shrewdness about money and the fierce concentration in guarding it. Had the willingness to invest solely in houses and land, the only true source of wealth to a Tuscan, kept the Buonarroti from ever wasting a scudo on art. Michelangelo could not remember having seen a painting or sculpture of the simplest nature in a Buonarroti house. This took considerable doing for a family of wealth living for 300 years in the most creative city in the world, where even homes of modest means had religious works that had come down through the generations. He turned back for a last look at the fresco walls of the Rucellai chapel, realizing with a sinking heart that the Buonarroti were not only stingy, they were enemies of art because they despised the men who created it. A shout from Buonarroti on the scaffolding called him. He found the entire studio moving in harmony. Buonarroti had put a heavy coat of intonaco on the panel the day before, hatching a rough surface on which he was now plastering the precise area to be painted that day. With Caico, Baldini and Tedesco he took up the cartoon, which they held over the wet panel. Michelangelo pounced the lines of the figures onto the fresh intonaco with a pointed ivory stick, then gave the signal for it to be taken away. The young apprentices scrambled down the scaffolding, but Michelangelo remained to watch Michelangelo mix his mineral earth colors in little jars of water, squeeze his brush between his fingers and commence his painting. He had to work surely and swiftly, for his task had to be completed before the plaster dried that night. If he delayed, the unpainted plaster formed a crust from the air currents blowing through the church, and these portions would stain and grow moldy. If he had failed to gauge accurately how much he could do that day, the remaining dry plaster would have to be cut away the following morning, leaving a discernible seam. Retouching was forbidden. Colors added later needed to contain size, which would discolor the fresco, turn it black. Michelangelo stood on the scaffolding with a bucket of water, sprinkling the area just ahead of Michelangelo's flying brush to keep it moist. He understood for the first time the truth of the saying that no coward ever attempted fresco. He watched Michelangelo moving boldly forward, painting the girl with the basket of ripe fruits on her head, the billowing gown then in fashion which made the Florentine girls look like carrying matrons. Next to him stood Buonarroti, painting the two older, sedate aunts of the Tornabuoni family, come to visit Elizabeth. Benedetto was highest on the scaffold, painting the elaborate cross-beam ceiling. Granexi had been assigned the serving girl in the center of the background, bringing in a tray to Elizabeth. David was working on Elizabeth reclining against the richly carved wooden bedboard. Buonarroti, who had been allotted the window and door frames, summoned Michelangelo to his side, flicking his fingers for him to sprinkle some water, then stepped back in admiration from the tiny window he had just painted above Elizabeth's head. "Have you ever seen a more beautiful window?" he demanded. "Brilliant, Buonarroti," replied Michelangelo. "Particularly the open space that we see through." Buonarroti studied his work, puzzled but proud. "You like that part too? Funny, I haven't painted it yet." The climax of the panel was reached when Michelangelo, with Buonarroti assisting, painted the exquisite young Giovanna Tornabuoni, elaborately robed with the richest of Florentine silks and jewels, gazing straight out at Michelangelo, not in the least interested in either Elizabeth, sitting up in her high-backed bed, or John, suckling at the breast of another Tornabuoni beauty sitting on the bed bench. The panel took 5 days of concentrated work. Michelangelo alone was not permitted to apply paint. He was torn. Part of him felt that though he had been in the studio for only 3 months he was as qualified to work the wall as the other 13-year-olds. At the same time an inner voice kept telling him that all of this feverish activity had nothing to do with him. Even when he felt most unhappy about being excluded, he wanted to run out of the choir and the studio to a world of his own. Toward the end of the week the plaster began to dry. The burnt lime recovered its carbonic acid from the air, fixing the colors. Michelangelo saw that his belief that the pigments sank into the wet plaster was a mistake. They remained on the surface, covered by a crystalline coating of carbonate of lime which fitted them the way the skin of a young athlete contains his flesh and blood. The entire panel now had a metallic luster which would protect the colors from heat, cold and moisture. But the amazing fact was that each day's segment was drying slowly to the very colors Galileo had created in his studio. And yet, when he went alone to Santa Maria Novella the following Sunday during Mass, weaving his way through the worshipping Florentines in their short velvet farsetti, doublets, voluminous cloaks of camlet trimmed in miniver, and high-crowned hats, he felt let down. So much of the freshness and vigor had leaked out from the drawings. The 8 women were still lifes in mosaic, as if made of hard bits of colored stone. And certainly it was not the birth of John to the modest family of Elizabeth and Zacharias, it was a social gathering in the home of a merchant prince of Italy, utterly devoid of religious spirit or content. Standing before the brilliant panel, the boy realized that Galileo loved Florence. The city was his religion. He was spending his life painting its people, its palaces, its exquisitely decorated rooms, its architecture and streets thronging with life, its religious and political pageants. And what an eye he had! Nothing escaped him. Since no one would commission him to paint Florence, he had made Florence Jerusalem, the desert of Palestine was Tuscany, and all the biblical people modern Florentines. Because Florence was more pagan than Christian, everyone was pleased with Galileo's sophisticated portraits. Michelangelo walked out of the church feeling depressed. The forms were superb, but where was the substance? His eyes hazed over as he tried to formulate words to shape the thoughts pushing against each other inside his head. He too wanted to learn how to set down accurately what he saw. But what he felt about what he saw would always be more important. He drifted over to the Duomo, where young men gathered on the cool marble steps to make laughter and view the passing pageant. Every day in Florence was a fair. On Sundays this richest city in Italy, which had supplanted Venice in its trade with the Orient, was out to prove that its 33 banking palaces were providing wealth for all. The Florentine girls were blonde, slender, they carried their heads high, wore colorful coverings on their hair and long-sleeve gowns, high-necked, with overlapping skirts pleated and full, their breasts outlined in filmier fabric and color. The older men were in somber cloaks, but the young men of the prominent families created the great splash between the Duomo steps and the baptistry by wearing their calzoni with each leg dyed differently and patterned according to the family blazon. Their suite of attendants followed an identical dress. Jacopo was sitting on top of an old Roman sarcophagus, one of several that stood against the jagged tan brick face of the cathedral. From here he kept up a running comment about the passing girls while his scandalous eye sought out the ones to whom he awarded the highest accolade. Ah, how mattressable! Michelangelo went to Jacopo's side, ran his hand caressingly over the sarcophagus, his fingers tracing out in its slow relief the funeral procession of fighting men and horses. Feel how these marble figures are still alive and breathing. His voice carried such exaltation that his friends turned to stare at him. Now his secret had burst into the open of the Florentine dusk, with the sinking sun setting the domes of the baptistry and cathedral on fire. His hunger had gotten the better of him. God was the first sculptor, he made the first figure, man. And when he wanted to give his laws, what material did he use? Stone. The 10 Commandments engraved on a stone tablet for Moses. What were the first tools that men carved for themselves? Stone. Look at all us painters lolling on the Duomo steps. How many sculptors are there? His fellow apprentices were stunned by the outburst. Even Jacopo stopped searching for girls. They had never heard him speak with such urgency, his eyes glowing like amber coals in the fading light. He told them why he thought there were no more sculptors, The strength expended in carving with hammer and chisel exhausted mind and body alike, in contrast to the brushes, pens and charcoal which the painter used so lightly. Jacopo hooted. "Granex," I answered his young friend. "If extreme fatigue is the criterion of art, then the quarryman taking the marble out of the mountain with his wedges and heavy levers has to be considered nobler than the sculptor, the blacksmith greater than the goldsmith, and the mason more important than the architect." Michelangelo flushed. He had made a bad start. He studied the grinning faces of Jacopo, Tedesco and the two 13-year-olds. "But you have to agree that the work of art becomes noble in the degree to which it represents the truth? Then sculpture will come closer to true form, for when you work the marble the figure emerges on all four sides." His words, usually so sparse, spilled over each other. The painter laid his paint on a flat surface and by use of perspective tried to persuade people that they were seeing the whole of a scene. But just try to walk around a person in a painting, or around a tree. It was an illusion, a magician's trick. Now the sculptor, he carved the full reality. That was why sculpture bore the same relationship to painting that truth did to falsehood. And if a painter blundered, what did he do? He patched and repaired and covered over with another layer of paint. The sculptor on the contrary had to see within the marble the form that it held. He could not glue back broken parts. That was why there were no more sculptors today, because it took 1,000 times more accuracy of judgment and vision. He stopped abruptly, breathing hard. Jacopo jumped down from his perch on the lid of the sarcophagus, extended his two arms to indicate that he had taken over. He was bright, he liked painting and understood it even though he was too lazy to work at it. Sculpture is a bore. What can they make? A man, a woman, a lion, a horse. Then all over again. Monotonous. But the painter can portray the whole universe, the sky, the sun, the moon and the stars, clouds and rain, mountains, trees, rivers, seas. The sculptors have all perished of boredom. Sebastiano Maynardi joined the group and stood listening. He had taken his wife for her weekly walk, then returned to the Duomo steps in the company of his young men friends which, like all Florentines, he enjoyed more than that of women. There were spots of color on his usually pale cheeks. That's true. The sculptor needs only a strong arm and an empty mind. Yes, empty. After a sculptor draws his simple design, what goes on inside his head during the hundreds of hours that he has to pound these chisels and points with a hammer? Nothing. But the painter has to think of 1,000 things every moment, to relate all the integral parts of a painting. Creating the illusion of a third dimension is craftsmanship. That's why a painter's life is exciting, and a sculptor's dull. Tears of frustration welled in Michelangelo's eyes. He cursed himself for his inability to carve out in words the stone forms that he felt in his innards. Painting is perishable, a fire in the chapel, too much cold, and the paint begins to fade, crack. But stone is eternal. Nothing can destroy it. When the Florentines tore down the Colosseum, what did they do with the blocks? Built them into new walls. And think of the Greek sculpture that is being dug up, 2,000-3,000 years old. Show me a painting that's 2,000 years old. Look at this Roman marble sarcophagus, as clear and strong as the day it was carved. And as cold, cried Tedesco. Maynardi raised his arm for attention. Michelangelo, he began gently. Has it ever occurred to you that the reason there are no sculptors left is because of the cost of material? A sculptor needs a rich man or organization to give him a supply of marble and bronze. The Wall Guild of Florence financed Ghiberti for 40 years to make the doors of the baptistry. Cosimo de' Medici supplied Donatello with the resources he needed. Who would provide you with the stone? Who would support you while you practiced on it? Paint is cheap, commissions are abundant, that's why we take on apprentices. And as for the danger of working in sculpture and making the fatal mistake, what about the painter working in fresco? If the sculptor must see the form inherent in the stone, must not the painter foresee the final result of his color in the fresh wet plaster and know precisely how it will turn out when dry? Michelangelo numbly had to agree that this was true. Besides, continued Buonarrotti, everything that can ever be accomplished in sculpture has already been created by the Pisanos, by Ghiberti, or Cagna, Donatello. Take the Desiderio di Settignano or Mino di Fassole, they made pretty, charming copies of Donatello. And Bertoldo, who helped Donatello cast his figures, and was there to learn the secrets that Donatello learned from Ghiberti. What has Bertoldo created except a few miniatures reduced from Donatello's great concepts? And now he's sick and dying, his work done. No, the sculptor can do little more than copy, since the range of sculpture is so narrow. Michelangelo turned away. If only he knew more. Then he could convince them of the magnificence of fashioning figures in space. Granixi touched the boy's shoulder comfortingly. Have you forgotten, Michelangelo, what Praxetel said? Painting and sculpture have the same parents, they are sister arts. But Michelangelo refused to compromise. Without another word he walked down the cool marble steps, away from the Duomo, over the cobbled streets to home. The night was sleepless. He rolled and tossed. The room was hot, for Ludovico said that air coming in a window was as bad as a crossbow shot. Buonarrotti, who shared the bed, was placid in sleep as in all other things. Though 2 years younger than Michelangelo, he was the manager of the 5 boys. In the bed closer to the door, with the curtains drawn around it, slept the good and evil of the Buonarrotti progeny, Leonardo, a year and a half older than Michelangelo, who spent his days yearning to be a saint, and Giovansimo, 4 years younger, lazy, rude to his parents, who had once set fire to Lucrezia's kitchen because she had disciplined him. Sigismundo, the youngest, still slept in a grundle at the foot of Michelangelo's bed. Michelangelo suspected that the boy would never be anything but a simpleton, since he lacked all capacity to learn. Quietly he sprang out of bed, slipped into his loincloth bray, short drawers, shirt and sandals, and left the house. He walked down the Via dell'Anguillara, the streets freshly washed and the stoops scrubbed, to Piazza Santa Croce, where the Franciscan church stood rough and dark in its unfinished brick. As he passed the open-sided gallery his eyes sought the outline of the Nino Pisano's sarcophagus, held up by its 4 carved allegorical figures. He turned left on the Via del Fosso, built at the second limit of the city walls, past the prison, then the house belonging to the nephew of Street Catherine of Siena, and at the end of the street, at the corner of the Swallows, the city's famous chemist's shop. From here he turned into Via Pietrapiana, Street of the Flat Stones, which led through Piazza Sant'Ambrogio, in the church of which were buried the sculptors Verrocchio and Mino di Fassole. From the piazza he followed the Borgo La Croce until it led to a country road called Via Pontassieve, at the end of which he came to the Uffico River, an affluent of the Arno, its green banks covered with trees and luxuriant vegetation. After crossing the Via Bigentina he reached Varlongo, a little cluster of houses at what had been a Roman ford, then turned once again to the left and made his way up the slope towards Settignano. He had been walking for an hour. Dawn flashed hot and bright. He paused on the hillside to watch the mammal hills of Tuscany emerge from their dark sleep. He cared little about the beauties of nature that so moved painters, the red poppies and the growing green wheat, the stands of almost black cypresses. No, he loved the valley of the Arno because it was a sculptured landscape, God was the supreme carver, the lyrical hills, each range composed by a draftsman's hand, complementing the succeeding ranges as they rolled back, with nothing the eye could see that was carelessly conceived. In the clarity of its air, distant peaks, rolling ridges, villas, trees though miles away, stood out to be touched, their form tactile. Here nature's perspective worked in reverse: the more distant the object, the nearer at hand it seemed. The Tuscan was a natural sculptor. When he took over the landscape, he built his stone terraces, planted his vineyards and olive orchards in harmony with the hills. No two haycocks were shaped the same. Each family inherited a sculptural form: circular, oblong, umbrella, tent, which stood as a sign for the farm. He climbed the cart road into the hills, closed in by the walls that are the buttress of the Tuscan's life, giving him privacy and security, and at the same time sustaining his land and his sovereignty, standing as much as 13 feet high to hold the descending slopes, and built to last 100 generations. Stone was the dominant factor. With it he built his farms and villas, enclosed his fields, terraced his slopes to retain his soil. Nature had been bountiful with stone. Every hill was an undeveloped quarry. If the Tuscan scratched deep with his fingernail, he struck building materials sufficient for a city. And when he built of dry rock, his walls stood as though masoned. The skill with which men handle stone tells how civilized they are. He left the road where it turned off for the quarry at Maiano. For 4 years after his mother died he had been left to roam this countryside, though it was the proper age for him to be in school. There was no master at Settignano, and his father had been too withdrawn to dot. Now he climbed through land of which he knew every jutting boulder and tree and furrow. His upward push brought him to the settlement of Settignano, a dozen houses collected around a grey stone church. This was the heart of the stonemason country, having bred the greatest scalpellini in the world, the generations that had built Florence. It was only 2 miles from the city, on this first rise above the valley floor, and an easy haul to town. It was said of Settignano that its surrounding hills had a stone heart and velvet breasts. As he walked through the tiny settlement toward the Buonarrotti home, he passed a dozen stone yards scattered among the pottery or farms. Shortly, he came to the big yard that had produced the Desiderio di Settignano. Death had caused him to drop his hammer and chisel at the age of 36, but even by that time he was famous. Michelangelo knew well his marble tombs in Santa Croce and Santa Maria Novella, with their exquisite angels, and the Virgin carved so tenderly that she appeared asleep rather than dead. The Desiderio had taken in Mino da Fassole, who was just a young hewer of stones, and taught him the art of carving marble. Mino had wandered off to Rome in grief over the loss of his master. Now there was no sculptor left in Florence. Ghiberti, who had trained Donatello and the Michelangelo brothers, had died some 33 years before. Donatello, who had died 22 years ago, had operated a studio for half a century, but of his followers Antonio Rossellino had been dead 9 years, Luca della Robbia 6, Verrocchio had just died. The Michelangelo brothers had moved to Rome 4 years ago, and Bertoldo, Donatello's favorite and heir to his vast knowledge and workshop, was fatally ill. Andrea and Giovanni della Robbia, trained by Luca, had abandoned stone sculpture for enameled terracotta reliefs. Yes, sculpture was dead. Unlike his father, who wished he had been born 100 years before, Michelangelo asked only that he could have been born 40 years ago so that he could have been trained under Ghiberti, or 30 years, so he could have been apprenticed to Donatello, or even 20 or 10 or 5 years sooner, so that he could have been taught to work the marble by the Michelangelo brothers, by Verrocchio or Luca della Robbia. He had been born too late, into a country where for 250 years, since Nicola Pisano had unearthed some Greek and Roman marbles and begun carving, there had been created in Florence and the valley of the Arno the greatest wealth of sculpture since Phidias completed his work on the Greek Parthenon. A mysterious plague which affected Tuscan sculptors had wiped out the very last of them. The species, after having flourished so gloriously, was now extinct. Sick at heart, he moved on. Down the winding road a few hundred yards was the Buonarotti villa in the midst of a 5-acre farm, leased to strangers on a long-term agreement. He had not been here for months. As always he was surprised by the beauty and spaciousness of the house, hewn 200 years before by the best Maiano Beatrice Serena, graceful in its austere lines, and with broad porches overlooking the valley, the river gleaming below like a silversmith's decoration. He could remember his mother moving in the rooms, leaving on the broad downstairs porch, kissing him good night in his big corner room overlooking the Buonarotti fields, the creek at the bottom, and the Topolino family of stonemasons on the opposite ridge. He crossed the backyard and the bone-textured stone walk past the stone cistern with its intricate hatching and cross-hatching from which he had taken his first drawing lesson. He then scampered down the hill, between the wheat on one side and the ripening grapes on the other, to the deep creek at the bottom, shaded by lush foliage. He slipped out of his shirt, short drawers and sandals and rolled over and over in the cool water, enjoying its wetness on his anxious tired body. Then he crouched in the hot sun for a few moments to dry, put on his clothes and climbed refreshed to the opposite ridge. He paused when he came in sight of the yard. This was the picture he loved, one which meant home and security for him, the father working with tempered iron chisels to round a fluted column, the youngest son beveling a set of steps, one of the older two carving a delicate window frame, the other graining a door panel, the grandfather polishing a column on a pumice wheel stone with thin river sand. Behind them were 3 arches, and under them scurrying chickens, ducks, pigs. In the boy's mind there was no difference between a scalpellino and a sculptor, a stone-cutter and a sculptor, for the scalpellini were fine craftsmen, bringing out the color and grain of the Beatrice Serena. There might be a difference in the degree of artistry, but not in kind. Every stone of the Passy, and Medici palaces was cut, beveled, given a textured surface as if it were a piece of sculpture, which to the Settignano scalpellino it was. Lesser craftsmen were confined to making routine blocks for smaller houses and paving stones for the streets. Yet so proud were all Florentines of their simplest paving blocks that the whole town bragged of the wretch who, being jostled in the cart that was taking him to the Palazzo della Signoria for hanging, cried out in protest. What idiots were these, who cut such clumsy blocks? The father heard Michelangelo's footsteps. Buondi, Michelangelo. Buondi, Topolino. Come ba. How goes it? Donca email. Not bad. E.T. And you? Donca email. The Honorable Lodovico? He goes well. Topolino did not really how things went with Lodovico. He had forbidden Michelangelo to come here. No one got up, for the stonemason rarely breaks his rhythm. The 2 older boys and the one exactly Michelangelo's age called out with welcoming warmth. Benvenuto, Michelangelo. Welcome. Salve. Good health, Bruno. Salve, Gilberto. Salve, Enrico. The scalpellino's words are few and simple, matching in length the single blow of the hammer. When he chips at the stone he does not speak at all. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, no word from the lips, only the rhythm of the shoulder and the moving hand with the chisel. Then he speaks, in the period of pause, 1, 2, 3, 4. The sentence must fit the rest count of 4 or it remains unsaid or incomplete. If the thought must be involved, it will be spaced between several word counts of 7, filling 2 or 3 counts of 4. But the Sculptor has learned to confine his thinking to what can be expressed in the single 4-count pause. There was no schooling for the stoneman. Topolino figured his contracts on his fingers. The sons were given a hammer and chisel at 6, as Michelangelo had been, and by 10 they were working full-time on the stone. There was no marriage outside a stone ring. Agreements with builders and architects were handed down from generation to generation, as were the quarrying jobs at Maiano, where no outsider could find work. Between the arches hung an oblong piece of pietra serena with examples of the classic treatments of the stone: herringbone, subia-punch hole, rustic, crosshatch, linear, bevel, centered right angle, receding step, the first alphabet Michelangelo had been given, and still the one he used more comfortably than the lettered alphabet with which he had been taught to read the Bible and Dante. Topolino spoke. "You're apprenticed to Galanteo?" "Yes." "You do not like it?" "Not greatly." "Baccato." "Too bad." "Who does somebody else's trade makes soup in a basket," said the old grandfather. "Why do you stay?" It was the middle brother asking. "Where else is there to go?" "We could use a cutter." This was from Bruno. Michelangelo looked from the oldest son to the father. "Davvero?" "It is true." "Davvero? You will take me as apprentice?" "With stone you're no apprentice. You earn a share." His heart leapt. Everyone chipped in silence while Michelangelo stood above the father who had just offered him a portion of the food that went into the family belly. "My father." "Echo. There you are." "Can I cut?" The grandfather, turning his wheel, replied. "Every little bit helps," said the father who peed into the Arno because his son's boat was beached at Pisa. Michelangelo sat before a roughed-out column, a hammer in one hand, a chisel in the other. He liked the heft of them. Stone was concrete, not abstract. One could not argue it from every point of the compass, like Cavour theology. No theorist had ever separated stone from its quarry bed. He had a natural skill, unrusted after the months of being away. Under his blows the pietra serena cut like cake. There was a natural rhythm between the inward and outward movement of his breath and the up and down movement of his hammer arm as he slid the chisel across a cutting groove. The tactile contact with the stone made him feel that the world was right again, and the impact of the blows sent waves of strength up his skinny arms to his shoulders, torso, down through his diaphragm and legs into his feet. The pietra serena they were working was warm, an alive blue-gray, a reflector of changing lights, refreshing to look at. The stone had durability, yet it was manageable, resilient, as joyous in character as in color, bringing an Italian blue sky serenity to all who worked it. The Topolinos had taught him to work the stone with friendliness, to seek its natural forms, its mountains and valleys, even though it might seem solid, never to grow angry or unsympathetic toward the material. Stone works with you. It reveals itself. But you must strike it right. Stone does not resent the chisel. It is not being violated. Its nature is to change. Each stone has its own character. It must be understood. Handle it carefully, or it will shatter. Never let stone destroy itself. Stone gives itself to skill and to love. His first lesson had been that the power and the durability lay in the stone, not in the arms or tools. The stone was master, not the mason. If ever a mason came to think he was master, the stone would oppose him toward him. And if a mason beat his stone as an ignorant contadino might beat his beasts, the rich, warm, glowing, breathing material became dull, colorless, ugly, died under his hand. To kicks and curses, to hurry and dislike, It closed a hard stone veil around its soft inner nature. It could be smashed by violence but never forced to fulfill. To sympathy, it yielded, grew even more luminous and sparkling, achieved fluid forms and symmetry. From the beginning he had been taught that stone had a mystic. It had to be covered at night because it would crack if the full moon got on it. Each block had areas inside where it was hollow and bent. In order for it to remain docile it had to be kept warm in sacks, and the sacks kept damp. Heat gave the stone the same undulations it had in its original mountain home. Ice was its enemy. Stone will speak to you. Listen as you strike with the side of your hammer. Stone was called after the most precious of foods, carne, meat. The Scalpellini respected this stone. To them it was the most enduring material in the world. It had not only built their homes, farms, churches, town, but for 1,000 years had given them a trade, a skill, a pride of workmanship, a living. Stone was not king but god. They worshipped it as did their pagan Etruscan ancestors. They handled it with reverence. Michelangelo knew them as men of pride, to for their cattle, pigs, vines, olives, wheat. This was ordinary work. They did it well in order to eat well. But working the stone, that was where a man lived. Had not. The Settignanis quarried, shaped and built the most enchanting city in all Europe, Florence. Jewel of the stone carver's art, its beauty created not by the architect and sculptor alone but by the Scalpellino, without whom there would have been no infinite variety of shape and decoration. Monna Margherita, a formless woman who worked the animals and fields as well as the stove and tub, had come out of the house and stood under the arch, listening. She was the one about whom Lodovico had said bitterly, when Michelangelo wished to work with his hands, "A child sent out to nurse will take on the condition of the woman who feeds him." She had cycled him with her own son for 2 years, and the day her breast ran dry she put both boys on wine. Water was for bathing before Mass. Michelangelo felt for Monna Margherita much as he did for Monna Alessandra, his grandmother, affection and security. He kissed her on both cheeks. "Buongiorno, figlio mio. Buongiorno, madre mia. Pazienza," she counseled. "Galanteio is a good master. Who has an art, has always a part." The father had risen. "I must choose at Cave Maiano. Will you help load?" "Willingly." "Arrived Ursi, nonno, grandfather." "Arrived Ursi, Bruno." "Addio, Gilberto." "Addio, Enrico." "Addio, Michelangelo." They rode side by side on the high seat behind the 2 beautiful-faced white oxen. In the fields the olive pickers were mounted on ladders made of slender tree stalks, notched to take the light crossbar branches. Baskets were tied around their waists with comma flat against the stomach and crotch. They held the branches with their left hand, stripping down the little black olives with the milking movement of the right. Pickers are talkers, 2 to a tree, they speak their phrases to each other through the branches, for to the contadino not to talk is to be dead a little. Topolino said under his breath. "Does love another's prattle." The road, winding along the contour of the range, dipped onto a valley and then slowly climbed Mount Sassari to the quarry. As they rounded the bend of Maiano, Michelangelo saw the gorge in the mountain with its alternating blue and gray Serena and iron-stained streaks. The Pietra Serena had been buried in horizontal layers. From this quarry Brunelleschi had chosen the stones for his exquisite churches of San Lorenzo and Santo Spirito. High on the cliff several men were outlining a block to be quarried with a scribus, a point driven against the grain to loosen the hold from the main mass. He could see the point marks and successive layers through the stone formation, layers of stone peeled off as though stripped from a pile of parchment sheets. The level work area where the strata fell after they were loosed was shimmering with heat and dust from the cutting, splitting, shaping, by men wet with perspiration, small, lean, sinewy men who worked the rock from dawn to dark without fatigue and who could cut as straight a line with hammer and chisel as a draftsman with pen and ruler, as concentrated in their hardness and durability as the rock itself. He had known these men since he was 6 and began riding behind the white oxen with Topolino. They greeted him, asked how things went, a primordial people, spending their lives with the simplest and most rudimentary force on earth, stone of the mountain, thrown up on the 3rd day of Genesis. Topolino inspected the newly quarried stone with the running commentary Michelangelo knew so well. That one has knots. Too much iron in this shale, it'll crumble into crystals like sugar on a bun. This one will be hollow. Until finally, climbing over the rocks and making his way toward the cliff, he let out his breath sharply. Ah! Here is a beautiful piece of meat. There is a way of making stone lift itself by distributing the tension. Michelangelo had been shown how to handle the density of the material without pulling his arms out of their sockets. He planted his legs wide, swung his weight from the hips. Topolino opened the first crack between the stone and the ground with an iron bar. They moved the stone over the boulders to open ground, then with the help of the quarrymen the block was fulcrumed upward through the open tail of the cart. Michelangelo wiped the sweat from his face with his shirt. Rain clouds swept down the Arno from the mountains to the north. He bade Topolino goodbye. "Adamini," replied Topolino, flicking the lines for the oxen to move off. "Until tomorrow," Michelangelo thought, tomorrow being the next time I take my place with the family, be it a week or a year. He left the quarry, stood on the hill below Fesole. Warm rain fell on his upturned face. The dark clumps of leaves on the olives were silver-green. In the wheat the peasant women were cutting with colored kerchiefs over their hair. Below him Florence looked as though someone were sprinkling it with gray powdered dust, blotting out the carpet of red tile roofs. Only the mammal dome of the cathedral stood out, and the straight proud upward thrust of the tower of the Signoria, complementary symbols under which Florence flourished and multiplied. He made his way down the mountain, feeling 15 feet tall. Having taken a day off without permission, Michelangelo was at the studio early. Michelangelo had been there all night, drawing by candlelight. He was unshaven, his blue beard and hollow cheeks in the flickering light giving him the appearance of an anchorite. Michelangelo went to the side of the platform on which the desk stood majestically in command of its bottega, waited for Michelangelo to look up, then asked, "Is something wrong?" Michelangelo rose, raised his hands wearily to breast height, then shook his fingers up and down loosely, as though trying to shed his troubles. The boy stepped onto the platform and stood gazing down at the dozens of incomplete sketches of the Christ whom John was to baptize. The figures were slight to the point of delicacy. "I'm intimidated because of the subject," Michelangelo growled to himself. "I've been afraid to use a recognizable Florentine." He picked up a pen and flicked it swiftly over a sheet. What emerged was an irresolute figure, dwarfed by the bold John whom Michelangelo had already completed, and who was waiting, bowl of water in hand. He flung down the pen in disgust, muttered that he was going home for some sleep. Michelangelo went into the cool backyard and began sketching in the clear light that broke open Florence's summer days. For a week he drew experimentally. Then he took a fresh paper and set down a figure with powerful shoulders, muscularly developed chest, broad hips, a full oval stomach, and a robust pair of thighs rooted firmly in big solid feet, a man who could split a block of Beatrice Serena with one blow of the hammer. Michelangelo was shocked when Michelangelo showed him his Christ. "You used the model. The stonemason in Satignano who helped raise me." "Christ's a stonemason. He was a carpenter. Florence won't accept a working-class Christ, Michelangelo. They're used to having him genteel." Michelangelo suppressed a tiny smile. "When I was first apprenticed you said, 'The true eternal painting is mosaic,' and sent me up to San Miniato to see the Christ Baldo Vanetti restored from the 10th century. That Christ is no wool merchant from Prado." "It's a matter of crudity, not strength," replied Michelangelo, easy for the young to confuse. "I will tell you a story. When Donatello was very young he once spent a lot of time making a wooden crucifix for Santa Croce, and when it was finished he took it to his friend Brunelleschi. "It seems to me," said Brunelleschi, "that you have put a plowman on the cross, rather than the body of Jesus Christ, which was most delicate in all its parts." Donatello, upset at the unexpected criticism from the older man, cried, "If it were as easy to make this figure as to judge it, try to make one yourself." That very day Brunelleschi set to work. Then he invited Donatello to dinner, but first the two friends bought some eggs and fresh cheese. When Donatello saw the crucifix in Brunelleschi's hall he was so amazed that he threw up his arms in resignation, the eggs and the cheese that he had been holding in his apron falling to the floor. Brunelleschi said laughingly, "What are we to have for dinner, Donato, now that you have broken the eggs?" Donatello, who could not take his eyes off the beautiful Christ, answered, "It is your work to make Christs, and mine to make plowmen." Michelangelo knew both crucifixes, the one of Brunelleschi being in Santa Maria Novella. Stumblingly he explained that he preferred Donatello's plowman to Brunelleschi's ethereal Christ, which was so slight that it looked as though it had been created to be crucified. With Donatello's figure the crucifixion had come as a horrifying surprise, even as it had to Mary and the others at the foot of the cross. He suggested that perhaps Christ's spirituality did not depend on his bodily delicacy but rather on the indestructibility of his message. Abstract theology held no interest for Michelangelo. He turned back to his work, the automatic gesture of dismissal for an apprentice. Michelangelo went into the yard and sat in the baking sun with his chin resting on his chest. He had made a nuisance of himself. A few days later the studio was buzzing. Michelangelo had completed his Christ and was blowing it up to full size with color for the cartoon. When Michelangelo was permitted to see the finished figure he stood stunned. It was his Christ. The legs twisted in an angular position, a little knock-kneed, the chest, shoulders and arms those of a man who had carried logs and built houses, with the rounded, protruding stomach that had absorbed its quantity of food, in its power and reality far outdistancing any of the still-life-set figures that Michelangelo had as yet painted for the Tornabuoni choir. If Michelangelo expected Michelangelo to acknowledge him, he was disappointed. Michelangelo apparently had forgotten the discussion and the boy's drawing. The following week the studio moved en masse to Santa Maria Novella to start the Death of the Virgin in the crescent-shaped lunette topping the left side of the choir. Granicsai was pleased because Michelangelo had given him a number of the apostles to paint, and he climbed the scaffolding singing a tune about how passionately he loved his sweetheart, Florence, the object of all Florentines' romantic ballads. Up the scaffold went Maynardi to do the figure kneeling to the left of the recumbent Mary, and David on the extreme right, doing his favorite subject, a Tuscan road winding up a mountainside to a white villa. Santa Maria Novella was empty at this early hour except for a few old women in their black shawls praying before the Madonnas. The canvas screen had been taken down to let fresh air into the choir. Michelangelo stood irresolutely beneath the scaffolding, unnoticed, then began to walk the long center nave toward the bright sunlight. He turned to take a final look at the scaffolding rising tier upon tier in front of the stained glass windows, dark now in the slight western light, at the glowing colors of the several completed panels, the Girlandaio artists, tiny figures weaving across the lunette, at the wooden stalls at the base of the choir covered with canvas, the sacks of plaster and sand, the plank table of painting materials, all bathed in a soft glow. At the center of the church were a few wooden benches. He pulled one in place, took drawing paper and charcoal out of his shirt and began drawing the scene before him. He was surprised to see shadows climbing down the scaffolding. "It's time for dinner," announced Granicsai. Funny how painting spiritual subjects can give a man a carnal appetite. Michelangelo commented, "Today is Friday and you'll have fish instead of bistecca. Go along with you, I'm not hungry." The empty church gave him the chance to draw the architecture of the choir. Long before he would have imagined it, his comrades were climbing back up the scaffolding. The sun arched to the west and filled the choir with rich color. He felt someone staring holes through him from behind, turned to find Girlandaio standing there. Michelangelo remained silent. Girlandaio whispered hoarsely, "I can't believe that a boy of such tender years can have received such a gift. There are some things you know more about than I do, and I have been working for over 30 years. Come to the studio early tomorrow. Perhaps we can make things more interesting for you from now on." Michelangelo walked home, his face suffused with ecstasy. Granicsai teased, "You look like a beatified Francis Angelico saint floating above the paving stones." Michelangelo looked at his friend mischievously. "With wings? No one could call you a saint, not with your crusty disposition. But all honest effort to recreate that which God created originally is a form of worship. Has in it a love of God's universe. Else why would the artist bother?" "I have always loved God," replied Michelangelo simply. The next morning he waited impatiently for the first grey ash to sift into the narrow strip of sky over the Via de Bentecordi. In the Via of the country people were dozing in their carts as the donkeys and oxen cloped over the stones with their produce for the old market. He saw Giotto's company standing pink and white in the first street dawn. Even in his eager rush through the streets he had time to marvel at the dome which Brunelleschi had had the genius to build after the vast space had stood open to the skies and the elements for more than 100 years, because no one knew how to close it without the use of traverse beams. Girlandaio was at his table when Michelangelo arrived. "Sleep is the greatest of all bores. Draw up a stool." The boy sat before Girlandaio, who pulled aside the curtain behind him so that the north light fell on them. "Turn your head. A little more. I'm going to sketch you as young John leaving the city to go to the desert. I hadn't found a satisfactory model until I saw you working in Santa Maria Novella yesterday." Michelangelo swallowed hard. After his sleepless night's dream of originating whole cartoons with which to fill the still empty panels, Girlandaio had not meant to deceive his apprentice. He summoned Michelangelo, showed him the overall plan for the death of the Virgin, added casually, "I want you to collaborate with Granicsai in the scene of the Apostles. Then we'll let you try your hand at the figures on the left, together with the little angel beside them." Granicsai had not a jealous bone in him. Together they sketched the Apostles, the one bald-headed, the other supporting the weeping John. "Tomorrow morning after Mass," said Granicsai, "let's come back to the studio and I'll start you at bedrock." Granicsai had been speaking literally. He put Michelangelo to work on the rock wall at the back of the studio yard. "Your wall has to be sound. If it crumbles your fresco goes with it. Check for saltpeter. The slightest patch and your paint will be eaten up. Avoid the sand that has been taken from too near the sea. Your lime should be old. I'll show you how to use a trowel to get a full smooth surface. Remember, plaster has to be beaten with the least possible amount of water, to the consistency of butter. Michelangelo did as he had been instructed, but complained. Granixi, I want to draw with a pen, not a trowel. Granixi replied sharply. An artist has to be master of the grubbiest detail of his craft. If you don't know how to do the job, how can you expect the plasterer to get you a perfect surface? You're right. I'll beat it some more. When the mixture was right, Granixi handed Michelangelo a square board to be held in one hand, and a flexible 5-inch trowel with which to apply the plaster. Michelangelo soon had the feel of it. When the plaster had dried sufficiently, Granixi held an old studio cartoon against the wall while Michelangelo used the ivory pointing stick to outline several figures, then with Granixi still holding took up the little bag of charcoal to fill the holes. Granixi removed the cartoon. The boy drew a connecting outline with red ochre and, when this had dried, dusted off the charcoal with a feather. Maynardi came into the studio, saw what was going on and forcibly turned Michelangelo to him. You must remember that fresh plaster changes its consistency. In the morning you have to keep your colors liquid so that you don't choke up its pores. Towards sundown they have to be kept liquid because the plaster will absorb less. The best time for painting is the middle of the day. But before you can apply colors you have to learn how to grind them. You know there are only 7 natural colors. Let's start with black. The colors came from the apothecary in walnut-sized pieces of pigment. A piece of porphyry stone was used as a base, a porphyry pestle to grind with. Though the minimum grinding time was a half-hour, no paint was allowed on a Galataeo panel that had been ground hard for less than 2 hours. My father was right, commented Michelangelo, his hands and arms blackened with the pigment. To be an artist is first to be a manual laborer. Galataeo had entered the studio. Hold on there, he exclaimed. Michelangelo, if you want a real mineral black, use this black chalk. If you want a slag black you will need to mix in a little mineral green, about this much on your knife. Warming to the situation, he threw off his cape. For the flesh colors you have to mix 2 parts of the finest sinopia with 1 part white well-slaked lime. Let me show you the proportions. David appeared in the open door, one hand clutching a sheaf of bills, under his other arm an account book. What's the good of teaching him about colors, he exclaimed, if he doesn't know how to make his own brushes? Good ones are not always available. Look here, Michelangelo, these hog bristles are taken from white pigs, but be sure they're domestic. Use a pound of bristles to a brush. Bind them to a large stick like this. Michelangelo threw his stained arm ceilingward in mock despair. Help! You're crowding my whole 3 years of apprenticeship into one Sunday morning. When Granixi's fresco was ready, Michelangelo went up onto the scaffold to serve as his assistant. Galataeo had not yet given him permission to handle a brush, but he worked for a week applying the intonico and mixing colors. It was autumn by the time he completed his own drawings for the Death of the Virgin and was ready to create his first fresco. The early October air was crisp and lucid. The crops were in, the wine pressed, the olive oil secure in big jars, the contadini were cutting back the trees and hauling home the branches for winter warmth, the fields were lying fallow as the foliage turned a russet brown to match the warm stones of the crenellated Signoria tower. The 2 friends climbed the scaffolding loaded with buckets of plaster, water, brushes, mixing spoons, the cartoon and colored sketches. Michelangelo laid a modest area of intonico, then held the cartoon of the white-haired and bearded near saint with the enormous eyes. He used the ivory stick, the charcoal bag, the red ochre connecting line, the feather duster. Then he mixed his paints for the verticcio, which he applied with a soft brush to get a thin base. He picked up a finely pointed brush and with terraverde sketched the outstanding features, the powerful Roman nose, the deep-set eyes, the shoulder-long waving white hair and mustache flowing gracefully into the full-face beard. Freehand, glancing only once at his sketch, he put in the old man's neck, shoulder and arm. Now ready to apply paint in earnest, he turned to Ecstasy with big eyes. "I can't be of any more help to you, Michelangelo," responded Ecstasy, "the rest is between you and God. Buona fortuna. Good luck." With which he scrambled down the scaffolding. Michelangelo found himself alone at the top of the choir, alone on his perch above the church and the world. For a moment he suffered vertigo. How different the church looked from up here, so vastly hollow and empty. In his nostrils was the dampness of the fresh plaster and the pungence of paint. His hand clamped the brush. He squeezed it between the fingers and thumb of his left hand, remembered that in the early morning he would have to keep his colors liquid, took a little terraverde and began to shade all those parts of the face that would be darkest, under the chin, the nose, the lips, the corners of the mouth and the eyebrows. Only once did he go to the master of the studio for help. "How do I mix the exact shades I had yesterday?" "By the weight on your knife of the amount you cut off the pigment cake. The hand can judge more accurately than the eye." For a week he worked alone. The studio stood by to assist if called, but no one intruded. This was his baptism. By the third day everyone knew he was not following the rules. He was drawing anatomical nude bodies of male figures, using for models two men he had sketched unloading in the old market, then draping them with robes, the reverse of the practice of suggesting a man's bones by the folds of a cloak. Michelangelo made no effort to stop or correct him, contenting himself with the sotto voce. "I'll draw them the way God made Adam." Michelangelo had never seen an angel, and so he did not know how to draw one. Even more perplexing was what to do about the wings, for no one could tell him whether they were made of flesh or some diaphanous material out of the wool or silk gilt. Nor could anyone give him any information about the halo. Was it solid, like a metal, or atmospheric like a rainbow? The youngsters ragged him mercilessly. "You're a fake," cried Kaiko. "Those are no wings at all." "And a fraud," added Baldini. "They fade into the robe so no one can see them." "That halo could be taken for an accidental marking on the wall," contributed Tedesco. "What's the matter, aren't you a Christian? Haven't you any faith?" Michelangelo grinned in sickly fashion. "My angel is the carpenter's son downstairs of us. I asked his father to carve a pair of wings for him." His two figures were a distinct picture by themselves, located in the bottom corner of the lunette under a cone-shaped mountain crowned by a castle. The rest of the lunette was crowded with more than 20 figures surrounding the Virgin's high-pillowed bier, the saints and apostles' apocryphal faces set at slightly different angles of anguish. It was even difficult to find Mary. When Michelangelo came down from the scaffold the last time, Jacopo passed David's little black hat and everybody contributed a few scudi to buy wine. Jacopo raised the first toast. "To our new comrade who will soon be apprenticed to Rosselli." Michelangelo was hurt. "Why do you say that?" "Because you've stolen the lunette." Michelangelo never had liked wine, but this cup of Chianti seemed particularly galling. "Shut up with you now, Jacopo. I want no trouble." Late that afternoon Michelangelo called him aside. He had said no word to Michelangelo about his fresco, either of praise or criticism. It was as though he had never mounted the scaffold at all. He looked up from his desk, his eyes dark. "They are saying I am jealous. It is true." "Oh, not of those two figures, They're immature and crude. If they stand out, it's not because they are better drawn but because they don't fit into our studio style. My 6-year-old Ridolfo comes closer to copying the Bottega method than you do. But let there be no mistake, I am jealous of what will ultimately be your ability to draw. Michelangelo suffered a rare moment of humility. Now what am I going to do with you? Release you to Rosselli? Assuredly not. There is plenty of work ahead in these remaining panels. Prepare the cartoon for the figures of the assistants on the right. And try not to make them stand out like bandaged toes. Michelangelo returned to the studio late that night, took his copies of Gallante's drawings out of the desk and put back the originals. The next morning Gallante's murmured as Michelangelo went by. "Thank you for returning my drawings. I hope they have been helpful." The valley of the Arno had the worst winter weather in Italy. The skies overhead were leaden. The cold had a creeping quality that permeated stone and wool and bit at the flesh within. After the cold came the rain and the cobbled streets were running rivers. Anything not cobbled was a bog of mud. The only bright spot was the arrival of Isabella d'Aragone on her way north to marry the Duke of Milan, with her large train of ladies and gentlemen sumptuously gowned by her father, the Duke of Calabria. Gallante's studio had but one fireplace. Here the men sat at a semicircular table facing the flames, crowded together for warmth, their backs cold but their fingers getting enough heat to enable them to work. Santa Maria Novella was even worse. The choir was as icy as an underground cave. Drafts that blew through the church rattled the planks and leather thongs of the scaffolding. It was like trying to paint in a high wind, with one's nostrils breathing ice water. But if the winter was intense, it was brief. By March the tramontana had stopped blowing, the sun's rays had a little warmth in them again, and the skies were powdered with a touch of blue. On the second of these days Ecstasy burst into the studio, his usually placid eyes blinking hard. Michelangelo had rarely seen his friend so keyed up. "Come with me. I have something to show you." Ecstasy secured David's permission and in a moment the two boys were in the street. Ecstasy guided Michelangelo across town toward the Piazza San Marco. They paused a moment as a procession passed carrying relics of San Girolamo, a jaw and an arm bone richly bound in silver and gold, from the altar of Santa Maria del Fiore. On the Via Larga, opposite one side of the church, was a gate. "We go in here." He pushed the gate open. Michelangelo entered, stood confounded. It was an enormous oblong garden, with a small building, or casino, in the center, in front, and directly at the end of a straight path, was a pool, a fountain, and on a pedestal a marble statue of a boy removing a thorn from his foot. On the wide porch of the casino a group of young men were working at tables. All four walls of the garden were open loggias displaying antique marble busts, of the Emperor Hadrian, of Scipio, the Emperor Augustus, Agrippina, Nero's mother, and numerous sleeping cupids. There was a straight path leading to the casino, lined with cypresses. Coming from each corner of the quadrangle and centering on the casino were other tree-lined paths curving through green lawns as big as meadows. Michelangelo could not take his eyes from the loggia of the casino where two young men were working over a piece of stone, measuring and marking, while several others were carving with toothed chisels. He turned to Ecstasy, stuttered. "What is this?" "A sculpture garden." "But what for?" "A school." "School?" "To train sculptors." His knees sagged. "What sculptors?" "This garden belonged to Clarice de Medici. Lorenzo bought it for her, to be her home in case of his death. Clarice died last July, and Lorenzo has started a school for sculptors. He has brought in Bertoldo to teach." But Bertoldo was dead. No, he was only dying. Lorenzo had him carried here on a litter from Santo Spirito Hospital, showed him the garden, and told Bertoldo he must restore Florence to its days of greatness in sculpture. Bertoldo got off the litter and promised Lorenzo that the era of Ghiberti and Donatello would be recreated. Michelangelo's eyes devoured the garden, moving around the long loggias, consuming statues, Grecian urns, vases, the bust of Plato beside the gate. "That's Bertoldo now on the porch," said Granexi. "I met him once. Shall I present you?" Michelangelo shook his head up and down savagely. They walked down the gravel path, circled the pool and fountain. Half a dozen men from 15 to 30 years old were working at board tables. Bertoldo, a figure so slight as to seem all spirit and no body, had his long white hair wrapped in a turban. His red cheeks glowed as he instructed two boys in roughing a piece of marble. "Maestro Bertoldo, may I present my friend Michelangelo?" Bertoldo looked up. He had light blue eyes and a soft voice that strangely carried over the blows of the hammer. He looked at Michelangelo. "Who is your father?" "L'Audiobook di Leonardo Buonarrotti Simone." "I have heard the name. Do you work stone?" Michelangelo's brain stood numb. Someone called to Bertoldo. He excused himself and went to the other end of the loggia. Granexi took Michelangelo's hand and led him through the rooms of the casino, one displaying Lorenzo's collection of cameos, coins and medals, another, examples from all the artists who had worked for the Medici family, Ghiberti, who won Lorenzo de' Medici's great-grandfather's contest for the baptistry doors, Donatello, who was Cosimo de' Medici's protégé, Benozzo Gozzoli, who had frescoed the chapel in their palace with portraits of the Medici in his journey of the wise men to Bethlehem. Here were Brunelleschi's models for the Duomo, Francis Angelico's drawings of saints for San Marco, Masaccio's sketches for the Church of the Carmen, a trove that staggered the boy. Granexi again took him by the hand, led him down the path to the gate and out into the Via Larga. Michelangelo sat on a bench in the Piazza San Marco with pigeons thronging about his feet and the heel of his palm pressing his forehead bruisingly. When he looked up at Granexi his eyes were feverish. "Who are the apprentices? How did they get in?" "Lorenzo and Bertoldo chose them." Michelangelo groaned. "And I have more than 2 years left at Gerlanteois. Mamma mia, I have destroyed myself." "Pazienza," consoled Granexi. "You are not an old man yet. When you've completed your apprenticeship." "Patience!" exploded Michelangelo. "Granexi, I've got to get in. Now. I don't want to be a painter, I want to be a marble carver. Now. How can I get admitted?" "You have to be invited." "How do I get invited?" "I don't know." "Then who does?" "Someone must. Stop pushing. You'll shove me clear off this bench." Michelangelo quieted. Tears of frustration came to his eyes. "Oh, Granexi, have you ever wanted anything so hard you couldn't bear it?" "No, everything has always been there." "How fortunate you are." Granexi gazed at the naked longing on his friend's face. "Perhaps." End.